Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little unexpected, the Trojan War. But don't worry, it's not the typical history lesson. You probably won't survive this one. Picture it, an epic saga of love, betrayal, and ancient drama, filled with gods who can't mind their own business, heroes with egos, and a war that could have been avoided if anyone had just communicated. Oh, and a giant wooden horse. Yeah, we'll get there. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Go ahead and let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Let's make this a cozy global moment. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of the Trojan War is no ordinary tale. It's like one of those soap operas you can't stop watching, even though you know it's just going to spiral out of control. It's full of twists, tangled relationships, and so much drama that even the gods couldn't stay out of it. But how did we get here? How did a simple dispute over a woman become a war that lasted for a decade? Well, buckle up, because it's a ride that all starts with love, and the strangest beauty contest you've probably never heard of. Picture this. A group of goddesses standing in front of a young Trojan prince named Paris. These aren't just any goddesses. This is Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, the three most powerful and, let's face it, the most glamorous figures in Greek mythology. They were arguing over who was the most beautiful, and since Paris was a prince, they decided he was the one who would decide. Imagine being Paris for a second. One moment, you're minding your business, possibly enjoying a nice cup of wine, and the next, you're asked to judge the most important beauty contest in the universe. But wait, there's a catch. Each goddess offers Paris something in exchange for his vote. Hera promises him power beyond imagination, the ability to rule over everyone. Athena offers him wisdom, the type that could make him the most revered warrior of all. But it's Aphrodite who takes the cake. She offers him the love of the most beautiful mortal woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Now keep in mind, Helen's beauty was legendary. She wasn't just beautiful, she was the type of woman that made kings and heroes fight wars for her attention. So Paris, like any sensible prince, chooses Aphrodite's offer, because who wouldn't want to be with someone like Helen? Historians still argue whether Paris knew what he was getting into. Did he really think that taking Helen would be as simple as a romantic rendezvous? Or did he think that because he had the blessing of the gods, no one could stand in his way? Either way, his decision would set in motion one of the most dramatic conflicts in ancient history, and suddenly, things started to unravel. Now, here's the thing. Helen wasn't just some random woman who Paris had a fling with. No. Helen was married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta. And, as you can probably guess, Menelaus wasn't too thrilled about his wife running off with a handsome Trojan prince. He wasn't just angry either. He was absolutely livid. This wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a royal scandal that could affect the power dynamics of the entire Greek world. Historians still debate whether Menelaus's response was about love, pride, or power. Was he really heartbroken? Or was he more concerned about losing face and the political consequences of his wife's infidelity? Either way, Menelaus wasn't about to let Paris get away with this, and he called upon the other Greek kings and heroes to join him in retrieving his wife. This, my friends, is how a love affair turned into a full-blown international crisis. The call went out, and before long, the might of the Greek world was assembling. But it wasn't just any collection of warriors and kings. It was a group of the most legendary figures in Greek mythology, each with their own unique motivations and egos. These weren't the kind of guys who played nicely together. They were more like that group of friends who show up at a party and instead of hanging out, immediately start arguing over who gets to sit at the cool table. Achilles, the greatest warrior of his time, was among those who responded to Menelaus's call. But Achilles had his own problems. He was prideful, impulsive, and had a beef with the Greek leader Agamemnon. Achilles wasn't exactly looking for an excuse to fight for Menelaus's honor. In fact, he had his own reasons for being involved, but it wasn't all about saving Helen. Historians still argue whether Achilles' pride and desire for glory drove him more than any sense of loyalty to Menelaus. Was he seeking immortality through his deeds, or was he genuinely concerned with helping Menelaus recover his wife? Either way, it's fair to say that Achilles was already preparing to make this war all about him. And then, there was Agamemnon, the brother of Menelaus, who had a slightly different agenda. Agamemnon was a king, and like many rulers, his decisions were often influenced by politics and personal ambition. He led the Greek forces, but his leadership wasn't without its own struggles. He had to deal with competing egos, feuding heroes, and the constant tension of keeping everyone happy. But most importantly, Agamemnon's decisions would come to define the course of the war in ways no one expected. And so the stage was set for the Trojan War, a war driven not just by love, but by pride, jealousy, and the whims of the gods. It wasn't going to be pretty, and from here on out, it would only get messier, with each decision spinning the wheel of fate faster and faster. As the Greek ships set sail toward Troy, the war began to unfold, not just on the battlefield, but also in the hearts and minds of the warriors involved. But before we dive into the bloodshed and chaos of it all, let's talk about the gods. Because let's face it, this war wouldn't be a proper soap opera without some divine interference. Imagine that you're just a mortal, out there fighting for your life, and suddenly, Zeus or Athena swoops down and says, "Hey, you're going to do this for me, or else." That's exactly what happened to the Greeks and Trojans. The gods were like the ultimate reality TV producers, pulling the strings behind the scenes and making everything even more complicated than it needed to be. The gods' involvement in the Trojan War wasn't just a minor subplot. They were central players, shaping the fate of mortals on both sides. And it wasn't like the gods were impartial observers either. They all had their favorites, and these divine alliances made the drama even more intense. On the Greek side, you had goddesses like Hera and Athena, who were all in on supporting the Greeks. Then on the Trojan side, you had the love goddess Aphrodite, who was backing Paris and the Trojans. Each god had their own personal stake in how the war would turn out. It's almost like a cosmic battle of egos, with mortal lives caught in the middle. Take, for example, the moment when Achilles is told to join the Greeks in their efforts. At the time, Achilles was a young, handsome warrior, the talk of the town. He could fight, he could charm, and most importantly, he was destined for greatness. But he wasn't just a warrior. He was also a demigod, which meant that the gods were personally invested in his fate. His mother, Thetis, was a sea goddess, and she was worried about him going off to war. After all, she knew what was at stake. Historians still debate whether Thetis's intervention was meant to protect Achilles or to ensure his glory. But either way, she did everything she could to influence his role in the war. She even had a special armor made for him, armor that would come to be legendary. But here's the kicker. Achilles' ultimate fate was sealed not by the strength of his body, but by the will of the gods. And so, while he was busy fighting to win, the gods had already set in motion the key events that would lead to his downfall. Meanwhile, on the Trojan side, things weren't much better. Paris, the Prince of Troy, may have been a charming figure with a big ego, but he wasn't exactly a warrior. He was more of a lover than a fighter. Enter Aphrodite, the goddess of love, who promised him Helen's love in exchange for his loyalty. And if you're thinking, oh, that's sweet, Paris gets a goddess on his side. Well, that's true. But Aphrodite had her own reasons for helping Paris. You see, Aphrodite didn't just want Helen to be with Paris because she loved him. She had a much deeper agenda. Her involvement in the war wasn't about love. It was about power and the influence she could wield by controlling Paris. Historians still argue whether Paris's decision to trust Aphrodite was the right one. Did he really think he could control a goddess? Or was he just swept up in the fantasy of it all? Either way, he made his choice, and that choice set him on a path that led to the downfall of Troy. The gods were playing their own game, and the mortals, well, they were just pawns on the chessboard. One of the most interesting divine interactions occurred when Hera and Athena, after being slighted in the beauty contest by Paris, decided to make things difficult for the Trojans. These goddesses were known for their cunning and vengeance, and they weren't going to let Paris get away with his disrespect. Hera, in particular, had a personal vendetta against Troy, and she was ready to make the Trojans pay for their arrogance. She wasn't the only one with a grudge. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, also wanted revenge for being snubbed. But Athena wasn't just angry about the contest. She had an agenda of her own. She wanted to see the Greeks succeed, and she was willing to use any means necessary to make that happen. So what did the gods do? They began to manipulate events behind the scenes, ensuring that the war wouldn't end easily. Athena even made sure that the Greek warriors would remain united, while Hera's involvement made sure that Troy's downfall would be inevitable. At the same time, the gods' interference made the war feel less like a human conflict and more like a cosmic chess game, with gods moving the pieces around like mere mortals. And that's what made the Trojan War feel like a never-ending soap opera. There was always something new happening, and you never knew whether the gods were going to help or hinder the heroes. You thought you knew what was going to happen next, but then a god would step in and turn everything upside down. It's like the ancient version of a plot twist you didn't see coming. Only this one had more immortals and less commercial breaks. Historians still debate whether the gods' involvement was a clever storytelling device or a reflection of the ancient belief that fate and divine will were intertwined. Either way, the Trojan War would never have been the same without the gods meddling in mortal affairs. And as you're about to see, this divine intervention set the stage for some of the most famous moments in the war, moments that still captivate us today. Now, we've got the gods all tangled up in this mess, but let's get to the heart of the drama. Helen. Oh, Helen. She's the woman who started it all. Now you might be thinking, wasn't she just the innocent party here? But no, Helen wasn't your average princess. She was, in fact, the most beautiful woman in the world. And when you're that beautiful, things get complicated. Her beauty wasn't just a blessing. It was a curse, one that sent the Greek world into a frenzy and started a war that lasted 10 years. Imagine being so gorgeous that kingdoms literally fell apart just to get a piece of you. Helen's story starts long before Paris ever showed up at her doorstep. She was originally married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta. Now Menelaus was a bit of a catch himself. Wealthy, powerful, and definitely not someone you'd want to cross. But as history tells us, there was one problem. Helen's beauty was irresistible, and many suitors came knocking on her door. Menelaus, being the strategic thinker that he was, decided to have all of Helen's suitors swear an oath. If anyone ever abducted Helen, all the others would come together to fight Bo and get her back. It was an early version of a "you break it, you buy it" agreement. Smart move, right? Or was it? Historians still debate whether Menelaus's marriage to Helen was one of true love or political strategy. Was Helen truly in love with him? Or was she just another piece in his royal chess game? Either way, this marriage would soon become a pivotal turning point for not just their lives, but the fate of the entire ancient world. Then enter Paris. Paris was young, charming, and, let's be honest, had a bit of a roguish quality to him. He was also, let's not forget, the Prince of Troy. So when he found himself in Sparta, Helen caught his eye. It was love at first sight, at least for Paris. And you can probably guess what happens next. Paris, aided by the goddess Aphrodite, who was in his corner, manages to steal Helen away from her husband. But this wasn't some simple love affair. Oh no, this was more like the ultimate power move. Paris didn't just run off with a woman. He took the heart of a kingdom, the spark that would ignite the flames of war. Helen's departure with Paris didn't just cause a scandal. It had monumental consequences. Menelaus was humiliated, yes, but more importantly, his honor was at stake. As any good king would, he immediately called upon the oath that all of Helen's suitors had sworn. That's when the Greek coalition began to form. Heroes from all corners of Greece, men like Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus, and many others, gathered to answer the call and sail to Troy. They weren't just fighting to win back a woman, they were fighting for their honor, their reputation, and the fate of their people. But here's the kicker. Helen didn't exactly hate Menelaus. She wasn't entirely in love with Paris either. Historians still debate whether she was just a pawn in this larger cosmic game. Was she trapped by her beauty, forced into a role that she had no control over? Or did she genuinely fall for Paris and truly want to be with him, regardless of the consequences? Either way, her fate was sealed as the face of the conflict, the object of desire that caused the downfall of Troy. Let's pause for a moment. Imagine you're Helen. You've been swept off your feet by a handsome prince, but now you're sitting in the middle of an ancient war, with your husband's army sailing toward you and your new lover's city preparing for a siege. What's going through your mind? The reality of the situation must have been overwhelming. On the one hand, you've got Paris, who's promised to protect you. On the other hand, you've got Menelaus, a man you once loved, coming to claim you back. And all of this is happening because of your beauty. And then there's the public perception. You're Helen of Troy, the woman who started it all. The judgment of the gods, the wrath of kings, and the destruction of an entire city are all laid at your feet. How do you even cope with the pressure? Was Helen a victim of the gods' manipulation, or did she hold some responsibility for the war that ravaged Troy? The answers are still up for debate. But what is certain is that Helen's beauty, once a gift, became a curse that led to her being at the center of one of history's most tragic and complex tales. Historians still argue whether Helen was an active participant in the decisions that led to the war or whether she was just a helpless figure caught in the drama of it all. Was she a symbol of beauty and power, a mere tool in the hands of the gods, or an unwilling participant in her own story? Either way, her actions, or lack thereof, would resonate through the ages, and her legacy would forever be intertwined with the rise and fall of Troy. So, the stage is set. The players are in motion, and the gods are watching from above, ready to intervene at every turn. As the Greeks and Trojans prepare for the inevitable clash, one question remains. How long can Helen stay out of the conflict she started? The answer, of course, is not long. But before we dive into the battles and bloodshed, let's take a step back and look at the key players who will shape this war. The heroes, the gods, and the mortals caught in the crossfire. Now that we've met Helen and Paris, let's talk about the real stars of the show. The legendary heroes who fought in the Trojan War. These were the men who would go down in history not just for their victories, but for their egos, their betrayals, and their larger-than-life personalities. If the Trojan War were a reality show, these guys would be the contestants who would create all the drama. But before we get into their messy relationships, let's first introduce the key players, those heroes whose names echo through time and whose actions set the stage for the chaos that would ensue. Let's start with the most famous of them all, Achilles. If you know anything about Greek mythology, you've probably heard of Achilles. He was the greatest warrior of the Greeks, a demigod with unmatched strength and skill. His name is practically synonymous with heroism. But here's the thing. Achilles wasn't just a hero. He was the hero. He wasn't the kind of guy who liked sharing the spotlight. If Achilles were in today's world, he'd probably be the lead in every action movie, with a few minor supporting characters thrown in. But what really sets Achilles apart from the others wasn't just his abilities on the battlefield. It was his unshakable pride. Historians still argue whether Achilles' pride was his strength or his downfall. On one hand, his unwavering self-confidence made him nearly invincible. On the other hand, it made him impossible to work with. Case in point, Achilles' falling out with Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek forces. Agamemnon, as you'll remember, was the brother of Menelaus, and he was the one who called the shots for the Greeks. But when he took a woman from Achilles, things got ugly fast. Achilles felt insulted, and in a classic display of his pride, he withdrew from the battle. This move would have disastrous consequences for the Greeks, but it was also the beginning of Achilles' personal journey, a journey that would ultimately lead to his tragic end. But let's not forget about Agamemnon. While Achilles might have been the greatest warrior, Agamemnon was the leader, the one who had to keep all the egos in check. And let me tell you, managing a bunch of famous heroes with their own agendas was no easy task. Agamemnon's leadership was constantly challenged, not just by Achilles, but by other strong-willed figures like Odysseus, who was always ready with a clever plan or an even cleverer insult. Agamemnon wasn't the type to back down from a fight, but his pride, much like Achilles, was both his strength and his weakness. It made him bold and decisive, but it also made him incredibly stubborn. This stubbornness led to more than one decision that would ultimately cost the Greeks dearly. Historians still argue whether Agamemnon's decision to take Achilles' prize woman was an act of power or a simple mistake. Did Agamemnon genuinely believe he was in the right, or was it just a battle of wills? Either way, this clash between the two Greek leaders would come to define much of the early conflict in the war. But remember, Agamemnon wasn't the only one with something to prove. Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, was also in the mix. Odysseus was a man of strategy, not brute strength. He wasn't the guy who charged into battle first, but he was the one who could outthink anyone. His mind was his greatest weapon, and his ability to devise clever plans and schemes made him one of the most valuable figures on the Greek side. But even Odysseus had his moments of doubt. His role in the war wasn't just about fighting. It was about making sure the Greeks kept their cool and didn't implode under the pressure. He was the one who kept the team together, so to speak. But even he couldn't avoid the petty squabbles and egos that threatened to tear the Greeks apart. Historians still debate whether Odysseus was the true hero of the Trojan War. Was he the mastermind behind the Greek victory? Or was he just a survivor, lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time? Either way, his role in the war was undeniable. He was the one who came up with the brilliant idea of the Trojan horse, a tactic that would ultimately lead to the fall of Troy. But as with all great plans, it wasn't without its consequences. Now, we can't talk about the heroes of the Trojan War without mentioning Hector, the Prince of Troy. Hector was the Trojan counterpart to Achilles, a mighty warrior, a loving husband, and a devoted father. Unlike Achilles, Hector wasn't driven by pride or glory. He fought for his family, for his people, and for his city. In many ways, Hector was the heart of the Trojan side. But just because he was noble didn't mean he didn't have his own inner conflicts. Hector's loyalty to his family and his city was unwavering, but as the war dragged on, he began to question whether his efforts were in vain. He saw his city falling apart, and he knew that his death was inevitable. Still, he fought on, determined to protect those he loved, no matter the cost. Historians still debate whether Hector's sense of duty and honor was a strength or a tragic flaw. Did his devotion to his people make him a hero, or did it blind him to the reality of the war? Either way, Hector's death would become one of the most tragic and poignant moments in the Trojan War, and it would leave his family and Troy forever broken. And that brings us to the central theme of the Trojan War: pride, loyalty, and the relentless drive for glory. The heroes of Troy and Greece were more than just warriors. They were symbols of the ideals and flaws that defined their respective sides. Achilles, Agamemnon, Odysseus, and Hector were all driven by the same desire: to be remembered. And that desire, while it made them legendary, also led them to make choices that would shape the outcome of the war. But before we get to the epic battles and heart-wrenching deaths, we must take a closer look at the divine influence that continues to shape this story. After all, the gods weren't done meddling in the lives of mortals just yet. So let's take a step back and examine the role of the gods in the Trojan War, a role that would only grow more complicated as the conflict raged on. Now, just when you thought things couldn't get any more complicated, the gods stepped back into the picture. If you thought that humans were the only ones making decisions that shaped the course of the Trojan War, think again. The gods were like a cosmic soap opera production crew, pulling the strings of the mortal characters, nudging them toward fate, and causing just enough chaos to keep the show interesting. They had their own rivalries, grudges, and alliances, and their divine meddling turned an already complicated situation into an all-out cosmic spectacle. As you already know, the gods were divided in their allegiances between the Greeks and the Trojans. But their involvement wasn't just a matter of picking sides. It was about fulfilling their own interests and egos. The gods saw the Trojan War as a way to assert their power, take revenge, and even settle personal scores. It wasn't about morality or justice. It was about influence. For them, humans were little more than pawns in their divine chess game. Let's take a closer look at some of the key gods involved and their roles in the war. First up, there's Zeus. As the king of the gods, Zeus could have chosen to stay out of the conflict entirely, but instead, he decided to play the role of a reluctant referee. He was determined to maintain balance, but that didn't mean he was above swinging the scales in favor of one side or the other when it suited him. At the beginning of the war, Zeus declared that he would not pick a side, but that didn't mean he remained neutral. He made sure that the war continued, ensuring that both sides suffered as much as possible, seemingly enjoying the chaos of it all. He was, in essence, the god of, let's see what happens next. Historians still debate whether Zeus's role in the war was one of impartiality or passive cruelty. Did he merely want to see how things would unfold? Or did he actively manipulate the situation for his own amusement? Either way, it's clear that his actions, or lack thereof, had a profound effect on the outcome of the conflict. Then, there's Hera, Zeus's wife, who had her own reasons for meddling in the war. Hera, of course, was the goddess of marriage and family. But she had a personal vendetta against the Trojans, especially Paris. She was still bitter about not being chosen as the most beautiful goddess in that infamous beauty contest, and she wasn't going to let Paris get away with it. Hera's primary goal was to see Troy fall. She was in the Greeks' corner, and she didn't mind using any means necessary to ensure that the Trojans were defeated. If that meant helping the Greek warriors with divine intervention, so be it. Historians still argue whether Hera's actions were justified or fueled by bitterness. Was she simply trying to protect the Greeks? Or was she motivated by a desire for revenge? Either way, her involvement in the war was undeniable, and she certainly made sure that her influence was felt on the battlefield. On the other side of the spectrum, we have Aphrodite, the goddess of love, who took a very different approach. Aphrodite's main interest in the war was ensuring the success of her favorite, Paris. As you remember, she was the one who promised Paris the love of Helen in exchange for his loyalty, and she wasn't about to let the Trojans lose. She used her powers of love and beauty to sway events in favor of Paris and his city. Whether it was protecting him in battle or manipulating the emotions of those around him, Aphrodite ensured that the war remained centered around her favored hero. Historians still debate whether Aphrodite's intervention was a result of true love for Paris, or if she had her own agenda in keeping Troy strong. Was she simply helping Paris because she wanted to see him succeed? Or did she have a larger plan to expand her influence in the mortal world? Either way, her role in the war proved that the gods weren't just fighting for control over the mortal world. They were also fighting for control over each other's legacies. And we can't forget about Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy. While she may have had a softer approach than Hera or Aphrodite, she was just as manipulative. Athena's loyalty was firmly on the Greek side, and she would do whatever it took to see them victorious. But what made Athena so dangerous wasn't just her wisdom. It was her ability to turn any situation into a strategic advantage. She wasn't interested in the chaos of the battle. She was interested in the long-term victory. While the other gods were swept up in their emotions and petty rivalries, Athena was calculating her next move. Historians still argue whether Athena's strategic mind was the key to the Greeks' success, or whether she merely took advantage of a war that was already going in their favor. Was her role in the war a matter of protecting the Greeks, or was she simply using them as tools in a much larger game? Either way, her involvement was pivotal in ensuring that the Greeks were always one step ahead, even when things seemed to be falling apart. Now, this divine interference didn't just stop at the gods. Even the lesser divine figures, like the nymphs, spirits, and demigods, took sides in the war. Some of these figures, like the goddess Thetis, Achilles' mother, were concerned about the fates of specific heroes, while others, like the river god Scamander, got involved because they were simply caught in the chaos of it all. The gods were constantly pushing and pulling, making sure that the war would never be simple. It was a game of divine manipulation, and the mortals were at the mercy of whatever god or goddess had the upper hand at that moment. Historians still argue whether the gods' interference was an essential part of the war's narrative, or if it was just a way to explain the unpredictable nature of fate. Did the gods act because they cared about the outcome of the war? Or did they simply enjoy watching mortals fight and struggle for their own amusement? Either way, one thing is certain. The gods' involvement made the Trojan War less of a human struggle and more of a divine spectacle. The mortals were not just fighting for their lives, they were fighting to fulfill the whims of the gods. So, as the Greek and Trojan armies prepared for the inevitable clash, it wasn't just their mortal struggles that determined the course of the war. It was also the divine influence of the gods, who saw this war as their personal stage to play out their rivalries, their egos, and their desires. And as you'll see in the next chapters, these divine interventions would lead to some of the most shocking twists in the war. By now, the stage is set, the gods are bickering in the background, and the key players on both sides are primed for action. The Greek and Trojan armies are about to collide, and the outcome of the war will ultimately depend on not just the strength and valor of the warriors, but also their strategic minds, their egos, and, of course, the whims of the gods. But before the battle begins in earnest, let's take a look at the first few days of fighting, the rising tensions, and the alliances that would soon be put to the test. The Greek fleet, having gathered at Aulis, finally set sail for Troy. The long-awaited confrontation between the two sides begins, and the sound of warriors preparing for battle fills the air. You can almost hear the clanking of armor, the shrill cry of the trumpets, and the roars of the men as they prepare to make history, or perhaps be consumed by it. As the ships approach the shores of Troy, it's clear that no one is quite sure what's about to happen. The Greek leaders are determined, but they're also aware that this is no small skirmish. This is a war that could change the course of their entire world. Historians still debate whether the Greeks were truly prepared for a 10-year-long siege, or if they were overly confident at the outset. Did they really believe they could defeat the Trojans in a short battle? Or were they simply unwilling to admit the enormity of what they were facing? Either way, the war quickly turned into a much longer and more complicated ordeal than anyone expected. It wasn't going to be a quick victory, and that reality began to set in as soon as the first battle was fought. One of the first major events of the war was a series of duels, fights between the greatest heroes from both sides. In many ways, these duels were more than just battles. They were symbolic. These fights were about more than just victory. They were about honor, glory, and the desire to prove one's worth on the grand stage of war. If you were a hero, you couldn't just sit back and let someone else fight your battles. You had to take the front line, regardless of the consequences. One of the first duels to take place was between Paris and Menelaus. Paris, the Prince of Troy, had already caused all this trouble by stealing Helen away from Menelaus, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. But Paris wasn't a warrior in the traditional sense. He wasn't exactly cut out for the brutality of battle. He was more of a lover than a fighter, and he knew it. So when the duel was called, he hesitated, knowing that he was outmatched by Menelaus. Historians still argue whether Paris was genuinely afraid to fight, or whether he was simply too proud to back down. Did he really think he could win? Or was he just trying to avoid the shame of fighting in front of the assembled armies? Either way, Paris wasn't going to fight Menelaus alone. At the last minute, his brother Hector intervened, offering to fight on Paris's behalf. Hector was a hero in every sense of the word. Brave, noble, and a true defender of Troy. His willingness to step in and fight for Paris was a reflection of the close bonds between the two brothers and their loyalty to each other. The duel between Hector and Menelaus didn't last long. Both men were powerful warriors, but neither of them was willing to risk it all in a fight that could be ended in an instant. Ultimately, the duel was inconclusive, and both sides were forced to accept a temporary truce. The gods, of course, were watching closely. They had their own opinions about the outcome, and they weren't shy about intervening. The truce didn't last long, though. Soon enough, the battle raged on, with the Greeks and Trojans clashing in a series of intense battles. The bloodshed was unimaginable, and both sides suffered heavy losses. As the war progressed, it became clear that this wouldn't be a quick victory for either side. The Greeks and Trojans were locked in a deadly stalemate, each side trying to outwit the other and gain the upper hand. Historians still argue whether this prolonged war was inevitable. Could the Greeks have defeated Troy earlier? Or was the siege bound to drag on for years? Did the gods play a role in prolonging the conflict, ensuring that neither side could gain a decisive advantage? Either way, the war was becoming a grinding, painful affair that saw no end in sight. It wasn't just the warriors who were feeling the weight of the conflict. It was everyone involved. The gods, too, were beginning to feel the strain, and their involvement in mortal affairs only seemed to increase as the war dragged on. One of the most dramatic moments in the early stages of the war occurred when Achilles, still angry over Agamemnon's slight, withdrew from the fighting. As the greatest warrior on the Greek side, his absence was deeply felt. Without Achilles, the Greeks struggled to gain ground against the Trojans. His withdrawal marked a critical turning point in the war, as the Greeks were forced to rely on their other warriors, many of whom were far less capable than Achilles. The Trojans, on the other hand, saw an opportunity. Hector, leading the Trojan forces, seized the moment, pushing the Greeks back and gaining the upper hand. Historians still debate whether Achilles' absence from the battlefield truly cost the Greeks the war, or whether it was just another example of the larger-than-life personalities at play. Did the Greeks lose momentum without Achilles, or were they simply waiting for the right moment to strike? Either way, it was clear that the war was no longer a straightforward battle for glory. It had become a test of endurance, strategy, and the resilience of both sides. As the war continued, the stakes only grew higher. The Greeks and Trojans both faced the harsh realities of war: food shortages, disease, and the ever-present threat of death. And through it all, the gods continued to meddle, offering support to their chosen champions, throwing obstacles in the path of their enemies, and, ultimately, ensuring that the war would drag on longer than anyone could have imagined. As the war trudged on, it became more than just a battle between two sides. It became a war of attrition, a test of wills, where every day felt like another chapter in a saga of inevitable destruction. The once hopeful Greeks, who thought they would conquer Troy in no time, were now bogged down in a long, painful siege. And yet, the conflict had something even more explosive on the horizon: the rise of the ultimate hero and the battle that would ultimately lead to the war's tragic climax. This was going to get a lot messier before it got better. Let's go back to Achilles, who, as you know, had withdrawn from the fight after his fallout with Agamemnon. But Achilles wasn't one to stay out of the action forever, especially when he was reminded just how vital his role was to the Greeks. His absence had made a real impact on the Greek morale. Without his strength, the Greeks were faltering, and their casualties were mounting. The Trojans, emboldened by his withdrawal, began to push back even harder. It was only a matter of time before Achilles would have to make his return. But here's the twist. Achilles' return wasn't about redemption or reconciliation. It was about pride. Achilles wasn't just returning to fight for Greece. He was returning to claim his honor. When his dear friend Patroclus was killed by Hector, Achilles felt the crushing weight of loss. But more than that, he felt the sting of his own ego. It wasn't just grief. It was a blow to his sense of self. Patroclus's death, while deeply emotional, reignited the fire in Achilles' heart, a fire that would burn brightly for the rest of the war. He didn't just want to avenge Patroclus. He wanted to prove that he was the greatest of all warriors, that no one could defeat him, not even Hector, the mighty prince of Troy. Historians still argue whether Achilles' thirst for vengeance made him a tragic hero or a victim of his own pride. Was he avenging his friend, or was he simply trying to restore his own wounded ego? Either way, Achilles returned to battle, and his wrath was unleashed in a way that made the war even bloodier. The moment Achilles rejoined the Greeks, it was like the tides of war shifted. The Greeks were suddenly emboldened, as if they knew that with Achilles on their side, victory was once again within reach. The Trojans, on the other hand, saw the return of their greatest enemy and knew that the stakes had just gotten even higher. But this wasn't just about strategy or tactics anymore. Achilles was a force of nature, and his rage was unstoppable. He charged into battle, cutting down enemies with ease until he finally faced Hector, the Prince of Troy. Historians still debate whether Hector's death was a turning point in the war. Was it the moment the Trojans realized they couldn't win, or was it simply another piece of the inevitable tragedy that awaited them? Either way, Hector's death was not just the end of a hero, it was the end of the Trojan dream. Hector had been the one figure who had held the Trojans together. With his death, their morale crumbled, and the sense of doom that had been looming over Troy became a reality. But Achilles' victory wasn't without its consequences. After slaying Hector, Achilles dishonored his enemy's body by dragging it behind his chariot, a display that shocked both the Greeks and the Trojans. It wasn't just a display of strength, it was a humiliation, a final insult to a man who had been a noble warrior. Achilles' actions sparked outrage on both sides. Even the gods were disgusted. This wasn't just the death of a hero, it was the death of honor. Historians still argue whether Achilles' actions after Hector's death were an act of vengeance or a sign of his spiraling madness. Did he dishonor Hector because he felt justified? Or was he simply consumed by his own rage? Either way, Achilles' actions pushed the Greek heroism to its breaking point, and the consequences were felt by all. As the war continued, the Greek forces began to break through Troy's defenses. They had lost many men, but they had also gained valuable intelligence from their spies. It wasn't long before they came up with a plan that would end the war once and for all, but not in the way anyone expected. Enter the Trojan horse. Historians still argue about the practicality of the Trojan horse. Was it a clever ruse, or was it just an elaborate scheme born out of desperation? Either way, the Greek forces decided that the best way to infiltrate Troy was to pretend they had given up and left. They left behind a massive wooden horse, hollowed out to conceal a group of their best soldiers. The Trojans, thinking it was a gift and a symbol of their victory, brought the horse into the city. It was only after the Trojans had celebrated and fallen into a deep, drunken sleep that the Greeks emerged from the horse and opened the gates of Troy to their waiting army. The gods, of course, had a role in this. It was Athena, goddess of strategy, who helped the Greeks make this plan a reality. Once again, the gods weren't just observers. They were active participants in this cunning plot. The Trojans, having fallen into a false sense of security, were caught completely off guard. It was a classic move of divine trickery, and it was enough to bring down Troy. Historians still debate whether the Trojans were simply too naive to see the trick coming, or if the gods truly orchestrated their downfall. Was it divine intervention, or was it just the culmination of a war of attrition? Either way, the fall of Troy marked the end of the war and the beginning of a new chapter for the Greeks, and for those who survived to tell the tale. As the city burned, the echoes of the Trojan War would reverberate through the ages. It wasn't just a war for honor or glory. It was a tragic spectacle, driven by the whims of gods and the pride of men. And yet, in the end, it was the human cost of the war that would leave the deepest scars. The gods had their fun, but the mortals were the ones who paid the price. As the smoke from Troy's burning walls rose into the sky, marking the end of one of the most tragic wars in history, The survivors on both sides were left to pick up the pieces. For the Greeks, the fall of Troy was a bittersweet victory. Yes, they had finally taken the city they had fought for so long to conquer, but at what cost? The war had cost them lives, honor, and sanity. Some of the greatest heroes, like Achilles, had fallen in battle, and the memory of Hector's death would haunt them forever. The gods had played their part too, but their influence only deepened the tragedy. The gods didn't care about the aftermath. They cared about their own rivalries and ambitions, leaving the humans to deal with the consequences. But the fall of Troy wasn't the end of the story. No, in fact, it was just the beginning of an even more harrowing journey for many of the survivors, especially for one of the most famous figures to emerge from the war, Odysseus. While the Greeks had won the war, they now had to face the daunting task of getting home, a task that would take Odysseus 10 long years, filled with perils, temptations, and endless obstacles. Historians still debate whether Odysseus's journey home was the greatest story ever told, or just a symbolic representation of the trials that awaited all men after war. Was Odysseus's journey a reflection of the personal toll that war takes on a hero? Or was it simply a series of adventures designed to entertain? Either way, his long, arduous journey home was legendary, and it was filled with encounters that tested his wit, strength, and character to their breaking points. In one of the most famous episodes of Odysseus's journey, he encounters the Cyclops, Polyphemus. Now, if you've ever heard the tale, you know how this one goes. Odysseus and his men are trapped in the cave of the one-eyed giant, and their only hope for survival is to outwit the beast. What follows is a brilliant act of cunning, with Odysseus tricking Polyphemus into drinking wine and then escaping by hiding under sheep. It's a story of resourcefulness, bravery, and survival against the odds. But here's the kicker. Odysseus's pride gets the better of him. As he sails away, he can't resist taunting Polyphemus, revealing his true identity. This, of course, leads to even more problems down the line. The curse that Polyphemus places on Odysseus is one of the reasons why Odysseus's journey back home takes so long. The gods, especially Poseidon, Polyphemus's father, become enraged, and Odysseus is forced to face even greater obstacles. Historians still debate whether Odysseus's pride was his tragic flaw or simply a part of his heroism. Was it his arrogance that made him an enduring legend? Or was it his inability to let go of his own ego that led to his endless suffering? Either way, his journey back to Ithaca was filled with lessons about humility, patience, and the cost of pride. Meanwhile, back in Troy, the aftermath of the city's destruction was just as brutal. The Trojans had fought with everything they had, but in the end, their city was reduced to rubble, and their people were scattered. The Trojan women, who had been taken as spoils of war, were left to face a future of uncertainty. In one of the most poignant moments of the war's aftermath, the Greek hero Odysseus, who had just helped sack Troy, found himself confronted by the broken remnants of a society. As he and his fellow Greeks prepared to leave, the fate of the Trojans and their city weighed heavily on them. It wasn't just the Greeks who had suffered from the war. The Trojans had lost everything. Families were torn apart, the city's wealth was plundered, and the very foundations of Troy were shaken to their core. Historians still argue whether the Greeks truly understood the cost of their victory. Was the fall of Troy a triumph for them, or was it a hollow victory, built on the destruction of another people? The Greeks had won the war, but in many ways, the price they paid, both in lives and in the moral cost of their actions, was immeasurable. The gods had played their part, but it was the human cost of the war that left the deepest scars. And then, There's the legacy of Troy itself. For centuries, the story of the Trojan War and its aftermath would be retold, passed down through the ages. Troy became more than just a city. It became a symbol of the folly of war, the fragility of honor, and the ultimate cost of human pride. The heroes of the war would be immortalized in poetry, literature, and art, but their stories were tinged with the awareness that their actions had led to the destruction of a great civilization. The gods may have had their fun, but it was the mortals who paid the price. Historians still debate the true legacy of the Trojan War. Was it a war that showed the power of human will? Or was it a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride and ambition? Did the war reveal the fragility of empires? Or was it simply a reflection of the eternal human struggle between love, revenge, and honor? Either way, the story of the Trojan War is a story that resonates through the ages, teaching us lessons about ourselves that still echo today. The gods have long since moved on, and the warriors of Troy and Greece are mere memories, their fates sealed by their own actions. But as you drift off tonight, think about the Trojan War not as a distant myth, but as a reflection of the struggles that we all face. The desire for glory, the cost of ambition, and the human cost of war are universal themes that continue to shape our world today. The Trojan War, as we've seen, was a tempest of bloodshed, betrayal, and divine meddling, with gods and heroes at each other's throats, leading to an unthinkable tragedy. But, as with most epics, the true consequences of such an event aren't always fully realized in the heat of the moment. While Troy was falling, the Greeks were celebrating their hard-won victory, unaware that their journey home would be just as dangerous and devastating as the war itself. And this, dear listener, is where the real story of the Greek heroes unfolds, when the dust settles and the glitter of victory fades. For the Greeks, there was one hero whose journey after the fall of Troy was perhaps even more legendary than his participation in the war itself: Odysseus. You've likely heard of the Odyssey, Homer's tale of Odysseus's journey home after the Trojan War. This isn't just a story about traveling across the seas. It's a story of endurance, intelligence, and the price one must pay for the pride and mistakes of war. Now, the Greeks had won, but the journey home was far from simple. For Odysseus, it was a journey that would span 20 years, a full generation, because, as it turns out, the gods were never done with their mortal playthings. The journey was full of peril, monsters, enchantresses, and temptations, each more dangerous than the last. And, as with most of Odysseus's escapades, it wasn't his physical strength that would get him through. It was his cunning, his wit, and his ability to think his way out of even the most impossible situations. Historians still debate whether Odysseus was truly the hero of his own story, or if his journey was a reflection of the horrors of war. Was his long journey home a symbolic punishment for the sins of the Greeks? Or was it just the inevitable result of angering the gods? Either way, his adventure was a masterclass in survival, and it was a reflection of the mental and physical toll war takes on the human spirit. But Odysseus wasn't the only Greek hero struggling to find his way home. After the fall of Troy, many of the other heroes had their own challenges. Agamemnon, for instance, returned to Greece only to be murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, in revenge for sacrificing their daughter to the gods before the war. His death was just another reminder that no one emerged unscathed from the war. Even the victorious leaders were doomed to face the consequences of their decisions. Historians still argue whether Agamemnon's death was poetic justice for his actions, or if it was simply another tragic outcome of the war. Was he a victim of his own hubris? Or was he just another casualty of a world where every action, no matter how noble, could lead to death. Either way, the consequences of the Trojan War didn't end with the fall of Troy. They carried on, wreaking havoc on the lives of those who had survived. And then there was the matter of Troy itself. The city, once mighty and proud, was no more. It had been reduced to rubble, its walls destroyed, its people scattered. The story of Troy became a symbol of destruction, a lesson in the dangers of pride, and a cautionary tale about the cost of war. The Trojans had been defeated, but their city and their people were left with nothing but memories. The fall of Troy would become an enduring symbol of the fragility of empires, a reminder that no matter how powerful a civilization may be, it is always one step away from collapse. Historians still debate whether the fall of Troy was inevitable, or if there was a moment when it could have been avoided. Could the Trojans have made a different decision, or were they doomed from the start? Was the city's fate sealed the moment Paris decided to abduct Helen? Or did their downfall come from the larger, more complex web of fate, pride, and divine interference? Either way, the fall of Troy became a symbol of the human condition, the idea that, no matter how hard we try, we are always at the mercy of forces larger than ourselves, whether they are gods, fate, or our own desires. But for the Greeks, the fall of Troy was just the beginning of their own downfall. They had won the war, but in the process, they had lost something far more valuable, something that could never be reclaimed. The heroes who had fought in the war, and the gods who had manipulated the events, were left to face the consequences of their actions. In the end, the Trojan War didn't just destroy Troy, it destroyed the Greeks too. The war had cost them their honor, their pride, and their humanity. They had gained victory, but it was a hollow one. Historians still debate whether the Greeks truly understood the cost of their actions. Did they recognize the destruction they had wrought, or were they blinded by their own glory? Was the war worth the price they paid? Either way, the Trojan War stands as a testament to the dangers of pride, the consequences of unchecked ambition, and the eternal struggle between fate and free will. And, as the dust of Troy settled and the Greeks sailed home, one thing became clear. The story of the Trojan War wasn't just a story about gods and heroes. It was a story about us. It's a story about human nature, about the desire for power, glory, and love, and about how these desires can shape our fate. Whether you're a Greek warrior or a Trojan prince, a god or a mortal, the story of the Trojan War is a reminder that no one escapes unscathed. The gods may have played their games, but it was the mortals who paid the ultimate price. The echoes of the Trojan War would resonate for centuries after the final embers of the city's ruins had long faded. For the Greeks, the war had left them victorious, yes, but at a steep price. The gods, with their divine interference, had played their part in shaping the war's outcome, but it was the mortal heroes who would bear the burden of what they had lost. As the last of the Greek warriors sailed away from Troy, they were not simply leaving the wreckage of a city behind. They were carrying with them the heavy weight of regret, pride, and an uncertain future. Odysseus's journey home was more than just a physical one. It was a metaphor for the toll the war had taken on his soul. Each trial he faced on his way back to Ithaca wasn't just a test of his strength or cunning. It was a test of his very identity. The man who had once led armies, who had stood at the forefront of the greatest battle in history, was now forced to confront his own limitations, his mistakes, and his humanity. As he sailed from island to island, encountering everything from the seductive sirens to the Cyclops, Odysseus found himself constantly battling not just external forces, but the consequences of his own actions. Every obstacle, Every challenge seemed to remind him of the cost of his pride, his cleverness, and his initial decisions during the war. It's almost as if the gods had set these trials before him, not just to punish him, but to make him reflect on the choices that had led to the war in the first place. Historians still debate whether Odysseus's journey was meant to symbolize the suffering of all Greek heroes, or whether it was just a personal reckoning for one man's mistakes. Was it an allegory for the devastating consequences of war, or simply a hero's story of redemption? Either way, the Odyssey stands as one of the greatest tales of human endurance, a tale that shows how even the greatest of heroes are not immune to the pain of their past. But let's not forget about the other survivors. For many of the Greek heroes, the aftermath of the war wasn't about a triumphant return. It was about confronting the wreckage they had left behind. Menelaus, for example, after regaining Helen, was forced to deal with the fallout from his wife's abduction and the deep emotional scars left by the war. While he had regained his wife, the years of conflict had changed him, and he couldn't return to the same life he had before. His reunion with Helena wasn't the romantic embrace of a fairy tale. It was the acknowledgement of how much had been lost in the years they were apart. Historians still argue whether Menelaus's return was a triumph or a tragic end to a long journey. Did he truly reconcile with Helen, or was their reunion more about restoring their shattered reputations? Was it an emotional closure, or was it simply the end of a cycle of violence? Either way, the war had changed them both. Menelaus had won his wife back, but the price of that victory was the loss of his former life, the innocence of his relationship, and the illusion of peace. As for Agamemnon, his journey home was far from a peaceful one. After the fall of Troy, he returned to his kingdom in Mycenae, but the gods had already cast their judgment upon him. His wife, Clytemnestra, furious over the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia to the gods, murdered him in a brutal act of vengeance. His death, coming so soon after the war's end, was a bitter reminder that the Greeks, despite their victory, had not escaped the consequences of their actions. Agamemnon's murder wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was the culmination of the sins committed during the war, a reminder that no one, not even the greatest of kings, could escape the wrath of those they had wronged. Historians still debate whether Agamemnon's death was an act of justice or just another consequence of the war's ravaging effects. Was he truly punished for his choices, or was it simply the inevitable result of the violence that had become a part of the Greek psyche? Either way, his death marked the final chapter of the Greek hero's journey, showing that victory in battle could never absolve one of the emotional and moral costs of war. The consequences weren't limited to just the Greek side. The fall of Troy left deep scars on the Trojan people, and the city's destruction became a symbol of the fragility of empires. The gods had their part in the fall, but it was the Trojans who paid the ultimate price. As the Greeks looted the city and took prisoners, the Trojans' once glorious civilization was reduced to ashes. The women of Troy, who had fought and suffered as much as their male counterparts, were left to face an uncertain future. Many were taken as slaves, their fates sealed by the whim of their conquerors. Historians still debate whether the Trojans were victims of their own destiny or simply pawns in a larger divine game. Could they have done anything to avoid their fate, or was the war inevitable from the start? Was their downfall a result of Paris's fateful decision to abduct Helen? Or was it a consequence of the gods' personal vendettas? Either way, the fall of Troy remains one of the most tragic and poignant moments in history, a reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, is immune to the ravages of time, pride, and war. In the end, The Trojan War wasn't just about the clash of armies. It was about the emotional, moral, and psychological toll that war takes on everyone involved. The gods, the heroes, and the common soldiers all paid a price for their actions. Victory came at a cost, and while the Greek side might have won the war, it was the Trojans who were left with nothing but the ruins of their once great civilization. The gods may have played their games, but it was the mortals who truly suffered. Historians still argue whether the Trojan War was a story of heroism, tragedy, or fate. Was it a war fought for love and honor? Or was it the inevitable result of divine manipulation and human folly? Either way, the legacy of Troy and the Trojan War lives on, reminding us that even in the most legendary of conflicts, the true cost is often paid by those who never had a chance to fight. As the Trojan War came to a close, its repercussions stretched far beyond the crumbling walls of Troy. The survivors, both Greek and Trojan, found themselves caught in the aftermath, struggling to make sense of their actions, their losses, and the divine forces that had shaped their fates. The war wasn't just about physical destruction. It was about a deep moral reckoning, a search for meaning in the face of unimaginable sacrifice. And while some heroes would live to tell their tales, the emotional scars of the war would remain forever etched in their hearts. For the Greeks, victory didn't bring the peace they had expected. The war had already worn them down, and as they made their way back to their homes, they were forced to face the deep emotional toll the conflict had taken on them. Some heroes, like Odysseus, would never truly return to the men they had been before the war. The war had transformed them, and it was impossible to return to the quiet, peaceful lives they had once known. For Odysseus, this would be especially clear during his long journey home, where every encounter, every trial, forced him to confront the darkness that had followed him back from Troy. But while Odysseus's journey was one of personal growth, it was also one of great loss. He lost companions along the way, and the path that led him back to Ithaca was littered with the remains of his past decisions. It was a journey defined not just by physical challenges, but by his internal struggle. As he faced monsters, gods, and temptations, he also faced his own guilt, regret, and the aftermath of the choices he had made during the war. Historians still debate whether Odysseus's trials were meant to symbolize the burdens that all Greek heroes carried after the war, or whether they were specific to his personal journey. Was Odysseus's endless wandering a reflection of the Greeks' need to process the chaos of the war, or was it simply a test of individual character? Either way, Odysseus's return to Ithaca wasn't just a reunion with his wife Penelope. It was a long-awaited confrontation with the self. But Odysseus wasn't the only one to suffer in silence. Agamemnon, for instance, returned to Mycenae after the war, only to be murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, in an act of vengeance. His return home, which was supposed to be a moment of triumph, became his final tragic moment. Clytemnestra had never forgiven Agamemnon for sacrificing their daughter, Iphigenia, to the gods before the war. His murder wasn't just the end of a king. It was a final, bitter reminder that no hero, no matter how powerful, could escape the consequences of their actions. Historians still argue whether Agamemnon's murder was a just punishment for his sacrifice of Iphigenia, or whether it was simply the result of a cycle of vengeance that had been set in motion by the war. Was his death an inevitable consequence of his role in the war, or was it a symbol of the destructive nature of revenge? Either way, his death marked the end of an era in which kings could act without consequence, and heroes could die without ever truly knowing the weight of their actions. As for the Trojans, their fate was equally tragic. The destruction of their city, their homes, and their way of life was a heavy price to pay for the decisions made by their leaders. The Trojans had fought with everything they had, yet in the end, they were left with nothing. Many of the greatest warriors, like Hector, were dead, and their families were scattered. The survivors were left to rebuild their lives in the ruins of a once great civilization. But no matter how hard they tried, they could never escape the shadow of the war. Troy had fallen, and nothing would ever be the same again. Historians still debate whether the Trojans had any real chance of winning the war, or whether their fate was sealed from the beginning. Could they have made different choices, or was their downfall inevitable, shaped by the gods and their own mistakes? Either way, the fall of Troy remains a powerful symbol of the fragility of empires, a reminder that no matter how great a civilization may be, it can always be destroyed by the forces of war, pride, and human error. And the gods, of course, didn't escape unscathed either. While they had orchestrated much of the conflict, they were not exempt from the consequences of their actions. The gods may have played their games, but the fallout from the Trojan War would continue to haunt them. Zeus, Hera, and the others may have achieved their objectives in the end, but they also sowed the seeds of further conflict. The gods who had once reveled in the chaos of the war would soon find themselves embroiled in even greater conflicts, as their own personal grudges and ambitions carried over into future generations. The Trojan War was just the beginning of a long cycle of divine manipulation, where mortals would continue to suffer under the weight of the gods' whims. Historians still debate whether the gods truly had the power to control the fate of mortals, or if they were simply reflections of the human psyche, embodiments of the desires, fears, and flaws that defined ancient society. Were the gods responsible for the suffering of the Trojan people, or were they simply the convenient scapegoats for the mistakes of mortals? Either way, the gods, like the mortals they ruled, were doomed to repeat the same cycles of revenge, ambition, and war. In the end, the Trojan War was not just a battle between Greeks and Trojans. It was a reflection of the eternal struggle between humanity's desires and the forces that control its fate. The heroes, the gods, and the people of Troy were Troy. And on primas soprata to their pal in the war, and the world that they left behind was forever changed. The lessons of the Trojan War, about pride, love, vengeance, and the cost of human ambition, remain as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. The war, with its complex web of divine manipulation and human folly, serves as a timeless reminder that no matter how grand the victory, no one escapes the consequences of war. As the final chapters of the Trojan War came to a close, the aftermath became its own tragedy, one that would shape the world for generations to come. The victors, Greek and Trojan alike, had all paid a price. The Greeks had won, but their hearts were heavy, their minds scarred by the brutality of the war, while the Trojans, devastated by their defeat, were left to rebuild their shattered lives. And at the center of it all, the gods who had manipulated the course of events continued to watch, their power undiminished, but their fates intertwined with those of the mortals they had shaped. The fall of Troy wasn't just a moment in history. It became the symbol of what happens when pride, love, and divine vengeance collide. And while the war itself ended, its effects were far-reaching, echoing through the stories of those who had survived. It wasn't just about what happened to the heroes after the war. It was about the legacy they left behind. For some of the Greek heroes, their legacies were defined by what they did after the war. Odysseus, for example, didn't just live through the war and return home. He became a symbol of the long, hard road to redemption. His journey home, filled with trials and tribulations, wasn't just about returning to his kingdom. It was about coming to terms with the chaos he had left behind. The Odyssey, while it tells the story of his adventures, also chronicles his deep internal struggle, his search for meaning, and his desire to return to the world he once knew, only to find that the world had changed, just as he had. Historians still debate whether Odysseus's journey was truly one of redemption, or whether it was a symbolic reckoning for the entire Greek world. Was his struggle a personal one, driven by the weight of his actions during the war? Or was it a larger commentary on the consequences of war itself? Either way, Odysseus's journey spoke to the emotional toll of the Trojan War, showing that no hero, no matter how mighty, can escape the long-lasting effects of their choices. But while Odysseus's journey home was a tale of survival, others like Agamemnon were not so fortunate. The Greek king, who had led the forces against Troy, returned to Mycenae only to be killed by his wife, Clytemnestra. This tragic death wasn't just the result of a wife's fury. It was a culmination of everything Agamemnon had sacrificed for the war. His decision to sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia, to the gods in exchange for favorable winds had haunted him throughout the conflict, and now it came back to claim him. Agamemnon's death was a sobering reminder that no leader, no matter how powerful, could escape the repercussions of their actions. Historians still argue whether Agamemnon's death was a poetic consequence of his actions, or whether it was the tragic end to a man who had been manipulated by the gods. Did he deserve to die at the hands of his wife? Or was he simply a victim of the war's cyclical violence? Either way, Agamemnon's death cast a long shadow over the Greek victory, a shadow that no amount of glory could erase. The Trojans, of course, faced a different kind of tragedy. With their city destroyed and their people scattered, the survivors of Troy were left to pick up the pieces of their once great civilization. While the gods had manipulated the Greeks, they had also played their part in the Trojans' downfall. The gods had promised victory to Paris, but they had also promised destruction. And in the end, it was the Trojans who paid the heaviest price. Historians still debate whether the Trojans were victims of fate, or if their downfall was the result of their own actions. Could they have avoided the war? Could they have surrendered Helen, or made peace with the Greeks before things spiraled out of control? Or was the fall of Troy simply the result of a larger cosmic plan, one that no mortal could hope to escape? Either way, the Trojans were left with nothing but their memories, and their story became a tragic legend that would be retold for centuries. But the most lasting legacy of the Trojan War wasn't just the stories of heroes or the gods' intervention. It was the lessons that it taught. The war wasn't just a battle of armies. It was a battle of pride, ego, and ambition. It showed how easily civilizations could be brought to the brink of destruction by a single act of desire, like Paris's choice to abduct Helen. It demonstrated how the gods, with all their power, could manipulate mortals and push them to act in ways that would lead to their own undoing. And, perhaps most importantly, it showed that no one, not even the greatest hero or the most powerful king, could escape the consequences of their actions. Historians still argue what the ultimate lesson of the Trojan War is. Was it about the dangers of unchecked ambition, the consequences of war, or the importance of divine favor? Was it a cautionary tale about the futility of seeking glory, or was it a tragedy about the cost of human pride? Either way, the war left behind more than just a legacy of destruction. It left behind a story that would shape the cultures of both Greece and Rome, and that would echo down through the centuries in literature, art, and mythology. And the gods, of course, didn't escape unscathed. The Trojan War marked a shift in how mortals and immortals would interact. The gods, for all their power, were not untouchable. They had manipulated the fate of Troy and the Greeks, but in the end, they too were left to deal with the consequences of their actions. The Trojan War had shown that the gods were not all-knowing or all-powerful. They could make mistakes, and they too could suffer the consequences of their decisions. But in the end, it was the mortals, those who had fought and died, that would be remembered, their legacies shaped by the gods, but also by the choices they made and the lessons they left behind. So as you drift off tonight, think about the lessons of the Trojan War. Think about how pride, love, and ambition led to the fall of one of the greatest cities in history. Think about the heroes, the gods, and the mortals who fought, bled, and died for their beliefs. And remember, even in the darkest of times, there is always something to learn from the mistakes of the past. As we near the final chapters of this great saga, the Trojan War's aftermath continues to unfold with profound lessons. The war that began with the simple act of a goddess's promise had escalated into something that no one could control, not even the gods themselves. And as the dust settled and the survivors trudged back to their homes, whether Greek or Trojan, there was a stark realization that while the battlefields were now quiet, the emotional wreckage would linger for years to come. For the Greeks, the war had been a journey filled with glory, loss, and pride. It was a war that celebrated the might of the heroes and the triumphs of kings. But it also exposed the vulnerabilities of those who believed in their own invincibility. Heroes like Achilles, once immortalized in song, faced the harsh reality that their deeds came with an emotional and moral price. Achilles, for instance, never truly recovered from the loss of Patroclus. His rage may have propelled him to kill Hector, but in the end, it was his own soul that bore the true cost. But it wasn't just Achilles who was left broken by the war. Even those who returned home with victory had to face the personal toll it had taken. Take, for example, Menelaus. His marriage with Helen, which had been shattered by Paris's abduction of her, was restored by the Greeks' victory. But Menelaus wasn't the same man who had once ruled Sparta. His years of war and the personal betrayal he had endured left him emotionally scarred. His reunion with Helen was not the happy ending many might imagine. It was a fragile reconciliation built on the ashes of war and the personal price of what had been lost. Historians still debate whether Menelaus's return to Helen was one of true healing, or whether it was the final acceptance of a love that had been irrevocably damaged. Was their reunion a symbol of hope after the war? Or was it merely an acceptance of their new, broken reality? Either way, Menelaus and Helen's story was one of many in the long list of individuals who could never truly return to what they had once known. The Trojan War had left them all, in one way or another, changed beyond recognition. On the other hand, the Trojans had suffered even more profoundly. The fall of Troy was not just the end of a war, it was the end of an era. The once glorious city, with its towering walls and majestic palaces, had been reduced to rubble. But more than the physical destruction, the fall of Troy marked the erasure of a civilization. The Trojans had fought fiercely, and their heroes, such as Hector, had been among the greatest warriors of their time. But in the end, their city was gone, and with it, their way of life. For the survivors, the war left a long-lasting trauma. The women of Troy, for instance, became victims not just of the Greek armies, but of the world's larger cruelty. Many were taken as slaves, forced to leave their homeland and live lives they had never chosen. The fate of women like Andromache, Hector's wife, was tragic. Her husband was killed, and her city was destroyed, leaving her to mourn the loss of everything she held dear. The gods had their own motives, but it was the mortal women who suffered the most. Historians still argue whether the Trojan women's suffering was meant to highlight the price of war or to cast a critical light on the nature of war itself. Did their fate serve as a commentary on the often overlooked consequences of conflict, or was it a tragic reality for every war? Either way, the fall of Troy was not just a tale of Greek triumph. It was a story of immense loss on both sides. The gods, meanwhile, had made their impact felt during the war, but the post-war world revealed cracks in their seemingly unassailable power. The gods, too, had their motives and desires, but in the end, they couldn't escape the consequences of their interference. The gods' alliances shifted, and their influence over the mortals they had manipulated began to wane. In the aftermath, they became less concerned with the fates of heroes and more concerned with their own legacies. Historians still debate whether the gods' involvement in the Trojan War was a necessary narrative tool, or whether it was a reflection of ancient Greek society's understanding of fate and divine will. Were the gods truly controlling the mortals, or were they simply reflections of human desires, weaknesses, and ambitions? Either way, the gods had played their part, and their involvement in the Trojan War left an indelible mark on the world they had created. As the years passed, the Trojan War became more than just a historical event. It became a myth, a legend, and a cautionary tale. It was a story that was retold by generations of poets, playwrights, and philosophers, each finding their own interpretation of its lessons. The themes of pride, love, revenge, and the human cost of war resonated through the ages, reminding every generation that war was never a simple victory or defeat. It was a complex, multifaceted tragedy that left scars on everyone involved, from the greatest hero to the lowliest soldier. The Trojan War also gave rise to a legacy of literature and art that would shape Western civilization for centuries to come. The tales of the heroes, of Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, and others, became the cornerstone of Western storytelling. And yet, while the heroes were immortalized in myth, their stories were never without the shadow of the war that had defined their lives. Historians still argue about the true legacy of the Trojan War. Was it a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and pride? Was it a story about the fragility of civilizations, the fleeting nature of glory, and the ultimate cost of war? Or was it something more? Either way, the Trojan War remains one of the most powerful and enduring stories of human history, a reminder that even the greatest empires and the heroes who build them are ultimately doomed to fall. And so, as you settle in for a night's rest, think about the legacy of the Trojan War. Think about the choices, the sacrifices, and the consequences. Think about the heroes and the gods, and how in the end no one, no matter how great, can escape the cost of war. The echoes of Troy still resonate, and as the legends continue to be told, their lessons remain just as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. As the Trojan War's legacy settled into myth and memory, its reverberations continued to shape the cultures that followed. The stories of heroism, betrayal, love, and sacrifice persisted not just in the minds of those who had witnessed it, but in the stories that echoed through generations. The war became more than just a conflict between two cities. It became a universal symbol of the destructive power of human emotions and divine intervention, a warning to those who would seek glory without regard for the cost. For the Greeks, the lessons learned from the war were far-reaching, influencing their culture, philosophy, and understanding of fate. The war wasn't just an event to be remembered. It was a mirror held up to the nature of humanity, a reflection of the complexities of love, honor, pride, and revenge. The Greeks, in their tragedies and epics, would explore these themes over and over again, examining the consequences of the Trojan War and the characters who shaped it. The gods, too, became central figures in Greek mythology, embodying the unpredictability of fate and the consequences of divine intervention in the mortal world. But what about the Trojans? For them, the war was not just a lost cause, it was the end of a civilization. The fall of Troy marked the loss of a people, a culture, and a city that had once been considered the height of grandeur. The Trojans were left with nothing but their memories, their stories, and their legends. Their legacy would be defined by their resistance, their pride, and their tragic end. And though the Trojans would be cast as the victims in many retellings of the war, their role in the narrative of human history was crucial. Their downfall was a stark reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, is safe from the ravages of pride and war. Historians still argue about the true significance of Troy's fall. Was it the inevitable consequence of Paris's decision to abduct Helen? Was it the result of a city's refusal to surrender, to give in to the demands of the gods and men? Or was it the culmination of a larger pattern, a story of hubris that could not be avoided? Either way, the destruction of Troy marked a pivotal moment in human history, one that would continue to resonate through the ages. In the end, the Trojan War wasn't just a story about the fall of a city or the rise of heroes. It was a story about the human condition, about love, loss, revenge, and the fragile nature of peace. The characters who participated in the war, whether they were mortal or divine, were driven by their desires, their fears, and their pride. And the war itself became a reflection of the tensions that have always existed within human societies: the desire for glory, the need for justice, and the inevitable consequences of unchecked ambition. So, as we reflect on the stories of the Trojan War, we must also consider the lessons that these stories impart. The gods may have played their part, but it was the mortals who suffered the most. The heroes of Troy and Greece, despite their valor and bravery, paid the ultimate price for their pride and their mertones. The gods, ever powerful, were not immune to the consequences of their interference. And in the end, the Trojan War stood as a cautionary tale, a story of how love and ambition could create both grandeur and devastation in equal measure. Historians still debate whether the Trojan War is merely a myth, or whether it has some historical basis in truth. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a city that fits the description of Troy, and some argue that the war itself may have been based on real events. But whether it was a literal war or a mythic one, the lessons it offers are timeless. The Trojan War reminds us that human nature has not changed in thousands of years. We are still driven by the same desires, the same fears, and the same flaws. Perhaps that's why the Trojan War still captivates us today. Its themes of love, pride, betrayal, and loss resonate with us in ways that other stories cannot. It's a tale that has stood the test of time, not just because of its action or its characters, but because it speaks to the deepest parts of the human experience. It's a story about the costs of war, the fragility of peace, and the consequences of our choices. It's a story that reminds us that, no matter how mighty or invincible we may feel, the gods, fate, and our own actions will always have the final say. So as we come to the end of our journey through the Trojan War, take a moment to reflect on the lessons it offers. Consider how pride, love, and revenge shaped the course of history, and think about how these same forces shape our world today. And remember, as the gods and mortals of ancient Greece learned the hard way, the path to glory is often paved with the greatest of sacrifices. The Trojan War may have ended, but its legacy lives on, woven into the very fabric of human history. Whether we look at it as a myth, a lesson, or a tragic tale of human ambition, the story of Troy and its heroes serves as a reminder of the price of war and the complexity of the human soul. As the echoes of the Trojan War reverberate through time, it's important to recognize that the end of the war did not truly mark the end of its impact. The myths, legends, and stories passed down through generations served as a powerful reminder that the price of war extends far beyond the battlefield. The heroes of Troy and Greece, who had once been celebrated for their bravery and valor, were now remembered not just for their victories, but for the human cost of their actions. Even those who were hailed as victorious carried with them the burdens of their choices. Odysseus, who had fought with unmatched cunning and intelligence, returned home after a long and arduous journey, but the man who walked into Ithaca was not the same as the one who had left. The war had scarred him deeply, and his journey home was not just about physical distance, but about the emotional and psychological toll that years of conflict had taken. His odyssey wasn't just about surviving the physical trials. It was about navigating the emotional wreckage of his past decisions. His reunion with his wife Penelope and the restoration of his kingdom were significant, but they were bittersweet. The cost of his long absence, the toll of war on his soul, and the weight of the lives lost along the way made every victory feel less sweet. Historians still argue whether Odysseus's return home was a true redemption or merely a return to a broken past. Was his journey about seeking forgiveness, or was it simply about survival? And even if he did find redemption, was it worth the toll it took on his character and those around him? Either way, Odysseus's journey serves as a poignant reminder that even the greatest of heroes must come to terms with the consequences of their actions. No victory can ever be entirely untainted, and the price of glory is often too high to bear. But Odysseus wasn't the only one affected by the war's aftermath. The Trojan War didn't just destroy cities, it destroyed lives. For those who survived, the rebuilding process was not just about physical reconstruction. It was about trying to heal emotionally from the wounds of war. The Trojans, once proud and strong, were left with the remnants of their city and the weight of their lost glory. The heroes of Troy, like Hector, had given everything for their city, only to see it reduced to ruins. The women of Troy, who had once held power in their own right, were now left to face a future of uncertainty and despair. Historians still debate the fates of the Trojan survivors. What happened to the women who were taken as slaves, or the children left orphaned by the war? Did they ever find peace, or were they doomed to live in the shadow of the war that had destroyed their world? And what of the Trojans who fought alongside Hector, who gave their lives for a cause that ultimately led to their downfall? Was their sacrifice in vain, or was it a testament to the enduring human spirit? Either way, the Trojans paid a heavy price for their defiance, and their legacy too would be remembered in the annals of history. And what about the gods? While they played an active role in the events leading up to the Trojan War, the aftermath of the war left them somewhat distant from the chaos they had caused. The gods had interfered in mortal affairs for their own amusement and rivalry, but after Troy's fall, they were left with little to show for it. The gods may have won their personal vendettas, but they too were affected by the war's outcome. They had watched mortals suffer, and in some cases, their own interference had led to irreversible consequences. The gods, with all their power, had become mere spectators of the tragedy they had helped create. Historians still argue about the role of the gods in the aftermath of the war. Did they truly care about the mortals they had manipulated, or were they merely following their own whims? Were the gods, as immortal beings, indifferent to the suffering they had caused, or were they themselves affected by the wreckage left in their wake? Either way, the gods' involvement in the Trojan War didn't end with the fall of Troy. It left a mark on their relationship with mortals, and it served as a reminder that even the gods, for all their power, are subject to the consequences of their actions. The Trojan War, then, was not just a tale of one battle between two nations. It was a story of the toll that war takes on everyone involved: the heroes, the gods, the cities, and the generations to come. It was a story of glory and loss, of love and revenge, of ambition and pride, and ultimately of the cost of human desires. The war may have ended, but the consequences of its actions would resonate for years, shaping the future in ways no one could have predicted. Historians still argue whether the Trojan War was an inevitable conflict, born of divine manipulation and human folly, or whether it was a series of decisions and choices that spiraled out of control. Could Troy have been saved? Or was its fate sealed the moment Paris made his fateful decision? Was the war a tale of fate? Or was it a story about the consequences of human choice? Either way, the war has become an enduring symbol of the cost of human ambition, and it remains one of the most powerful stories ever told. As we drift into the final thoughts on the Trojan War, it's important to remember that its legacy isn't just about the heroes or the gods. It's about the universal themes of human experience. The Trojan War teaches us about the dangers of pride, the fragility of civilizations, and the destructive power of unchecked ambition. It's a story that has endured because it speaks to something deep within all of us: the desire for glory, the need for love, and the consequences of our actions. So as you let go of the day and begin to sink into sleep, think about the lessons of the Trojan War. The gods may have played their games, but it was the mortals who paid the price. And in the end, no hero, no king, no city, no matter how mighty, could escape the cost of their desires. As the years passed, the Trojan War continued to be woven into the fabric of history, a tale of glory, loss, and the high cost of human ambition. Its themes, pride, vengeance, love, and betrayal, remained timeless, resonating through every generation that came after. The war, which had started as a conflict over a woman, became a monumental symbol of the destructive power of unchecked desire and divine interference. Yet, even as we remember the gods, the heroes, and the fates of both the Greeks and Trojans, we must also remember the more subtle legacies of the war, the smaller stories that arose from the conflict, and the quiet echoes of those who were caught in the middle. In the years after the war, many of the surviving heroes, those who returned to their homes and their kingdoms, found that life as they knew it had changed irreparably. For some, the war had left scars that could never be healed, both physically and emotionally. Their journey back to peace, to family, to whatever normalcy they could find, was not as simple as stepping off the battlefield. The ghosts of the war haunted them, from the faces of those they had lost, to the comrades they had left behind, to the memories of battles fought in the name of honor that now seemed pointless. Take, for example, the fate of Ajax the Greater, one of the mightiest warriors of the Greeks. He had fought with all his might, his shield and sword swinging relentlessly against the Trojans. But when it came time for him to receive the honor of Achilles' armor, an act that would solidify his place as the next greatest hero, Agamemnon and the Greek leaders chose Odysseus instead. Ajax's pride, already bruised by the toll of war, was shattered. In a tragic turn of events, he fell into a fit of rage, and in his fury, he took his own life. His death, a result of his fractured sense of honor and shame, was a stark reminder that even the greatest of warriors could be undone by the emotional wounds of war. Historians still debate whether Ajax's suicide was a result of divine fate or his own inner turmoil. Was it the gods who guided his hand, punishing him for his pride? Or was it simply the tragic end of a man who could not reconcile his identity as a warrior with the reality of a post-war world? Either way, Ajax's death was a cautionary tale about the perils of pride and the devastating emotional toll that war takes on even the most celebrated heroes. For other heroes, like Achilles, the emotional scars of the war never fully healed either. While Achilles' rage was temporarily appeased with Hector's death, it was clear that Achilles himself was always searching for something more than just glory. When he returned to fight for the Greeks, he did so not out of loyalty to Agamemnon or the Greek cause, but because his own pride and desire for immortality demanded it. His actions were a reflection of his unyielding desire to be remembered, to carve his name into the annals of history. And in the end, while he achieved that immortality, it came at the expense of his life. Historians still argue whether Achilles' relentless quest for glory was the ultimate tragic flaw or a necessary consequence of his greatness. Was he merely seeking immortality through his deeds, or was he seeking meaning in a world that offered none? Either way, Achilles' story remains one of the most poignant in the Trojan War, a story about a hero whose greatest strength was also his undoing. Then there's the aftermath for the survivors of Troy. While the Greeks may have won the war, the Trojans were left with nothing but ruin and heartache. The noble Hector, the face of Troy's resilience, had been killed by Achilles in a brutal duel. His widow, Andromache, found herself torn between the grief of losing her husband and the overwhelming fear of what awaited her as a slave in a foreign land. Even Helen, the woman whose beauty had set the war in motion, would never escape the shadow of her role in the war. Her life after Troy's fall was not one of glory or triumph, but one of quiet endurance, living in exile, a prisoner of both her past and her own beauty. Historians still debate whether Helen ever found true peace after the war. Was she a victim of the gods' manipulation, or was she a woman who, despite the destruction she had caused, ultimately paid the price for her beauty and the desires of men? Either way, her legacy would forever be intertwined with the war and the fall of Troy, a reminder of the fragility of human pride and the endless cycles of suffering that love can cause. Troy, of course, would not remain in the past forever. While the city's walls had been torn down, its memory was preserved in the stories that passed from one generation to the next. The Trojans, once the proud defenders of their city, were now remembered as the victims of a war they could not win, and their fall became an enduring symbol of the cost of arrogance, pride, and divine favor. But even in their defeat, the Trojans left behind a legacy of resistance, of defiance in the face of impossible odds. Their story would live on in the songs and stories of future generations, reminding everyone that even in the darkest of times, hope and courage still remain. The gods, too, continued to hold their place in the mythological pantheon. The fall of Troy had not ended their influence over the mortal world. It had simply shifted the focus to new dramas, new mortal struggles, and new conflicts to be manipulated. They watched from their heavenly thrones as humanity continued to grapple with the same themes that had sparked the Trojan War: love, pride, revenge, and the quest for glory. Historians still argue whether the gods were simply symbols of human flaws and desires, or whether they truly had the power to shape the world. Were they merely projections of mortal ambition, or were they divine entities guiding the fates of humans? Either way, the gods' involvement in the Trojan War had ensured that the conflict's legacy would never fade. Their actions had left deep imprints on the mortal world, just as the mortals themselves had left their mark on the divine realm. The Trojan War, despite its mythic status, remains as relevant as ever. It is a story not just of gods and heroes, but of humanity itself. It is a tale of glory and loss, of the complex interplay between divine will and human desire, and of the high price of ambition. And as we continue to look back on the war, its lessons about the cost of pride, the fragility of peace, and the eternal struggle for immortality, remain as poignant today as they were thousands of years ago. So, as the night settles in, and we find ourselves thinking about the Trojan War and all its legacies, remember that the story doesn't just belong to the past. It is a reflection of who we are and who we will always be. Heroes, gods, and mortals, all playing out our own struggles, seeking glory, and ultimately trying to understand the cost of our desires. With the dust of the Trojan War now settled, the stories of its survivors and heroes continued to be passed down for centuries. These weren't just the tales of great battles or grand victories, but stories of the deep emotional and psychological aftermath that follows in the wake of war. The Trojan War wasn't just about the heroes' deeds on the battlefield. It was about what happened when the fighting ended, when the glory faded, and when the survivors were left to face the price of their choices. The lessons learned from the war didn't stay in the past. They traveled through time, resonating in the hearts of those who heard them. For the Greeks, the cost of victory was steep. They had conquered Troy, but at what price? The glory they had sought for so long came with a price they weren't prepared for. The war had cost them their best warriors, their innocence and their peace. The gods may have smiled upon them at times, but their favor was fleeting. And even the great heroes, once celebrated as immortal, were left to suffer the consequences of their choices. The war had changed them all. Take Odysseus, for example. His journey home from Troy was long and fraught with peril. But even more than that, it was a journey within. A journey to understand the price of pride and the consequences of actions that were driven by ego, glory, and ambition. In the end, Odysseus's return wasn't just about reuniting with his wife, Penelope, and reclaiming his kingdom. It was about reckoning with the long shadow of the war. As he faced trials with gods and monsters, each one forced him to confront not just the world around him, but the man he had become. And even when he reached Ithaca, his homecoming was bittersweet. The home he returned to was not the same one he had left, and neither was he. Historians still debate whether Odysseus's homecoming was an emotional reckoning for a man who had seen too much, or whether it was simply a poetic conclusion to a long journey. Was his desire to return to his wife and his kingdom driven by a longing for peace, or was it a desire for closure, a need to finish what the war had started? Either way, his journey stands as a reflection of the emotional toll the Trojan War had taken on its heroes. The gods may have controlled the fates of mortals, but it was the mortals who had to live with the consequences. And then there was Agamemnon, another Greek hero who found that his victory came with a price too high to bear. Agamemnon's return to Mycenae was not the triumphant moment he had hoped for. After leading the Greeks to victory, he was murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, in revenge for the sacrifice of their daughter, Iphigenia. Agamemnon's story was one of pride, sacrifice, and vengeance. His decision to sacrifice his daughter for the gods was the catalyst for his downfall, showing that even the mightiest of kings are not immune to the consequences of their choices. Historians still debate whether Agamemnon's death was just punishment for his actions, or whether it was a tragic end to a man who had been a pawn in a much larger game. Was his sacrifice of Iphigenia a noble act, or was it an unforgivable betrayal? Either way, Agamemnon's death serves as a reminder that the cost of war doesn't just affect the soldiers. It affects families, loved ones, and the very foundations of civilization. The victory of the Greeks was ultimately hollow, and Agamemnon's death underscored the bitter truth that no one, no matter how powerful, can escape the consequences of their actions. But while the Greek heroes struggled to find peace, the Trojans had their own story to tell. The fall of Troy was not just the end of a city, it was the end of a civilization. And for those who survived, it was the beginning of a long, painful journey. The women of Troy, who had fought and suffered as much as the men, were left to face a future of uncertainty. They were taken as slaves, forced to leave their homeland and live under the rule of their conquerors. The Trojan women, once proud and powerful in their own right, were now broken by the war, their lives and identities reduced to mere property. Historians still argue whether the treatment of the Trojan women was a reflection of the gender dynamics of the time, or whether it was meant to underscore the true horrors of war. Were the women of Troy victims of divine intervention and mortal ambition, or were they simply the collateral damage of a war they had never chosen? Either way, their fate became a symbol of the devastation that war inflicts on those who are often overlooked in the stories of glory and victory. The Trojans, too, were forced to grapple with the emotional toll of their defeat. Hector, their greatest warrior, had died defending his city, and now his family and friends were left to mourn him and rebuild their lives from the ashes. For the Trojans, there was no victory to claim, no honor to defend, only the ruins of a once great civilization and the weight of their loss. And yet, their story endures, not just as a tale of defeat, but as a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. The Trojans fought to the very end, and though they lost, they were never truly defeated in heart. Historians still debate whether the Trojans' resistance was a symbol of pride and honor, or whether it was a tragic example of human folly. Was the fall of Troy inevitable, or could it have been avoided if they had made different choices? Either way, the Trojans' legacy lives on, not just as the defeated side in a great war, but as the symbol of resistance against impossible odds. The gods, too, left their mark on the war. While their influence was evident throughout the conflict, the aftermath of the war showed the gods to be as flawed and fallible as the mortals they controlled. The gods had meddled in the affairs of men, manipulating their fates to settle personal grudges and desires. But in the end, even the gods could not escape the consequences of their actions. Their interference in the lives of mortals had shaped the war's outcome, but it had also led to suffering and tragedy that would never be undone. Historians still argue about the role of the gods in the Trojan War. Were they merely reflections of human desires and emotions, or did they truly shape the fate of Troy and Greece? Were the gods responsible for the suffering of the mortals, or were the mortals simply acting according to their own desires and choices? Either way, the gods' involvement in the war ensured that the consequences of their actions would be felt for generations, both in the mortal world and in the divine realm. The Trojan War, in the end, wasn't just a tale of battles won and lost. It was a story about the cost of human ambition, the consequences of divine interference, and the emotional toll of war. It was a war fought not just by armies, but by the hearts and minds of those who lived through it. And while the war may have ended, its legacy lives on, reminding us all that even in the face of glory, there is always a price to pay. As the dust settled on the aftermath of the Trojan War, the legacies of both the victors and the vanquished became more than just stories of battle and bloodshed. They were stories of what it means to be human, the flaws, the struggles, the desires, and the consequences that come with our choices. The heroes who had once stood at the center of the war now stood at the heart of myths, and their tales would continue to inspire reflection, questioning, and understanding for generations to come. In the years following the war, the great civilizations of Greece and Rome would weave these stories into the very fabric of their cultures, reminding their citizens that even the greatest of heroes were not immune to the repercussions of pride, war, and ambition. And yet, despite the bitter lessons of the Trojan War, the myth of Troy endured as a timeless symbol of resilience and human spirit. While the Trojans had fallen, their story wasn't simply one of defeat. It was a story of resistance, of a city that fought until its last breath, knowing that it stood against a much larger and more powerful force. The Trojans were not just victims of war. They were the embodiment of the human struggle against impossible odds. And though they were ultimately destroyed, their story became a symbol of perseverance, a legacy that lived on long after the city's ruins crumbled into the dust. Historians still debate whether the Trojans were heroes or victims. Was their story one of noble resistance, or was it a tale of pride and stubbornness that led them to their downfall? Could they have avoided their fate if they had chosen differently? Or was the fall of Troy simply the inevitable consequence of their actions and the gods' manipulation? Either way, the story of Troy continues to resonate, reminding us that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, the will to fight and resist is a powerful force. For the Greeks, the war's aftermath was not one of simple victory either. While they had conquered Troy and claimed their prize, they were left to grapple with the emotional and moral consequences of their actions. The heroes who had fought for glory found that their victories were hollow, their triumphs fleeting. The gods may have helped them achieve their goals, but the human cost was impossible to ignore. Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, would spend years wandering the seas, his journey a constant reminder of the price he had paid for his participation in the war. Agamemnon, the great king of Mycenae, returned home only to be murdered by his wife, a tragic end that highlighted the true cost of his decisions. Historians still argue whether the Greeks' victories were worth the price they paid. Was the conquest of Troy a noble achievement, or was it a hollow victory built on the blood of innocents and the betrayal of loved ones? Could the Greeks have avoided the war, or were they simply destined to follow the path of pride and ambition? Either way, the Greeks' story is a reminder that war, no matter the outcome, always leaves behind scars, physical, emotional, and moral. The gods, too, found that their involvement in the Trojan War came with a cost. While they had been the ones who orchestrated much of the conflict, they were not without their own consequences. The gods' interference in the lives of mortals had created a tangled web of emotions, desires, and fates that no one, immortal or mortal, could escape. As the war came to a close, the gods were left to reflect on their roles in the grand scheme of things. Their manipulations had shaped the course of history, but at what cost? They had caused suffering, but they had also given rise to some of the most enduring stories of heroism and tragedy. Historians still debate whether the gods truly cared about the mortals they manipulated, or whether they were simply playing their own divine game. Were the gods the masterminds of human fate, or were they merely reflections of human desires and flaws? Either way, The gods' role in the Trojan War had forever altered the relationship between the divine and the mortal. They had influenced the course of history, but in doing so they had left behind a legacy of conflict and tragedy. As the centuries passed, and the story of the Trojan War became enshrined in the mythology of Greece and Rome, its lessons remained just as relevant as ever. The Trojan War wasn't just a tale of gods and heroes. It was a reflection of the human condition. It was a story of love and revenge, of honor and betrayal, of the high price of ambition and the consequences of divine intervention. And as each generation retold the tale, it became a timeless reminder of the cost of war and the enduring power of human desire. The Trojan War, like all great myths, endures not because it is a story of victory or defeat, but because it is a story of us. It is a story of the choices we make, the consequences we face, and the ways in which we are shaped by the world around us. The gods may have shaped the fate of Troy and its heroes, but it was the mortals who lived with the aftermath. And in their struggles, their triumphs, and their tragedies, we find the eternal truths of the human experience. Historians still argue about the lessons of the Trojan War. Was it a story about the dangers of pride, or a reflection of the eternal human desire for glory? Was it a cautionary tale about the cost of divine intervention, or a reminder that our own desires often lead us down paths we cannot control? Either way, the Trojan War remains a powerful story that continues to shape our understanding of the world. Its legacy lives on, not just in the pages of history, but in the choices we make every day. As you lie back and think about the Trojan War, take a moment to reflect on its lessons. Remember that, like the heroes of Troy and Greece, we all face choices that will shape our futures. And just as the heroes of the Trojan War were forced to reckon with the consequences of their actions, we too must live with the outcomes of the decisions we make. The war may have ended, but its lessons will echo through time, reminding us of the eternal struggle between glory and consequence. As we move deeper into the legacy of the Trojan War, we find that the ultimate consequences of the conflict were not just confined to the individuals who had directly participated, but also to the larger cultures that would eventually inherit the myth. The war, in all its complexity, became a mirror reflecting human nature at its best and its worst, a timeless narrative that helped shape the values of the ancient world and continues to influence how we view human struggles today. For the Greeks, the Trojan War wasn't just a historical event or a myth. It was a foundational myth, one that set the stage for the rise of Greek civilization. The war taught the Greeks about the nature of honor and shame, about the complexities of fate and divine will, and about the consequences of unchecked ambition. It was a story that showed them the fragility of even the greatest empires, the price of personal vendettas, and the ultimate futility of war. As the Greeks developed their philosophical and political systems, the war's themes would continue to resonate in their thinking. It was a story of personal pride, but also of the collective fate of an entire society. Historians still debate whether the Trojan War had a direct impact on the development of Greek democracy or philosophy. Did the story of Troy and its aftermath provide the foundation for Greek reflections on justice and the human condition? Was the war a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power that would shape the thinking of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle? Either way, the myth of Troy gave the Greeks a framework through which they could explore the complexities of human behavior and governance. And yet, the Trojan War's legacy wasn't confined to just Greek intellectual life. Its influence stretched into the realms of art and literature, where the epic stories of the war and its heroes would be immortalized for centuries to come. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey became foundational works in the Western literary canon, inspiring countless generations of writers, poets, and artists. These works explored the human condition in ways that resonated with people across cultures and eras. Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, and Helen became symbols of various facets of the human experience: the tragic hero, the devoted soldier, the cunning strategist, and the victim of beauty and love. Historians still argue about how the story of the Trojan War influenced Western art and literature. Was it the portrayal of the heroic struggle that resonated most with later generations? Or was it the tragic consequences of war and revenge that left the deepest impression? Either way, the Trojan War's legacy shaped the stories that would define Western culture, becoming a touchstone for understanding human aspirations, flaws, and the ultimate cost of war. The war also served as a lesson in the complexities of human relationships, especially those between men and women. While much of the Trojan War's story is about the male heroes and warriors, the women of Troy and Greece played pivotal roles in shaping the outcome. Helen's abduction was the spark that ignited the war, and the women of Troy, from Andromache to Cassandra, faced the devastating aftermath. For them, the war wasn't about glory or honor. It was about survival and loss. The Greek women, like Clytemnestra, who took revenge for the loss of her daughter, also provided a complex counterpoint to the male-driven narrative of the war. Historians still debate whether the women's role in the Trojan War is underplayed or misinterpreted in the traditional accounts. Were they simply pawns in the games of men and gods, or did they wield their own power in the narrative? Did the tragedy of the women of Troy reflect the vulnerability of women in ancient societies, or was it a subtle commentary on the costs of war, particularly for those left behind? Either way, the women of the Trojan War remain some of the most tragic and complex figures in the myth, offering a view of the conflict that is far more human than heroic. As the Trojan War's myth continued to spread and evolve, it also inspired further exploration of divine intervention in human affairs. The gods had played a significant role in shaping the conflict, but their actions raised questions about fate, free will, and the morality of divine interference. The gods' manipulation of mortal lives showed that even the most powerful beings in the universe weren't immune to the consequences of their own desires and rivalries. Zeus, Hera, Apollo, Athena, and the rest of the pantheon were not simply omnipotent beings. They were flawed and often acted out of jealousy, vengeance, or desire for control. The Trojan War thus became a reflection of the ancient world's understanding of the divine, with gods who were both awe-inspiring and deeply human in their flaws. Historians still debate whether the gods in Greek mythology were intended to represent real moral lessons about human behavior, or whether they were simply a reflection of the unpredictable nature of the universe. Were the gods' actions in the Trojan War a warning about the dangers of hubris, or were they a commentary on the complexity of human desires and the chaotic forces of fate? Either way, the gods' involvement in the war underscored the uncertainty of existence. No matter how much mortals tried to control their fate, they were always at the mercy of the whims of the gods. But for all the philosophical debates and moral lessons, the legacy of the Trojan War lies in its emotional and human resonance. The stories of Achilles, Hector, and the rest of the warriors are stories about love, loss, revenge, and the search for meaning. These heroes were not simply larger-than-life figures. They were people who experienced the deepest emotions and confronted the most universe of human struggles. Their stories are timeless because they speak to something fundamental in all of us: the desire for glory, the cost of ambition, and the tragic consequences of human pride. Historians still argue whether the enduring appeal of the Trojan War comes from its epic scale or from the deeply human stories that it tells. Is the war's significance rooted in its heroic battles and the gods' intervention? Or is it the emotional depth of the characters that makes it so enduring? Either way, the Trojan War remains one of the most significant narratives in human history, a tale that continues to resonate with audiences around the world, teaching us about the cost of ambition, the fragility of peace, and the unpredictable nature of fate. So, as we reflect on the Trojan War and its legacy, remember that its story is more than just a myth or a history lesson. It's a timeless reflection on what it means to be human, our flaws, our strengths, and the enduring consequences of our actions. From the battlefields of Troy to the quiet moments of reflection in the aftermath, the war's story remains as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago. The lessons of Troy, woven into the fabric of myth, continue to echo through time, reminding us all that even in our moments of greatest glory, there is always a price to pay. As the myth of the Trojan War continues to reverberate throughout history, it serves as a constant reminder that the consequences of war, both on a personal and societal level, extend far beyond the immediate aftermath. The echoes of this conflict stretch into every era, transcending the ancient world to influence not only literature and art, but also the ways in which we understand human nature, power, and the fragility of civilization itself. The story of Troy isn't simply one of gods and warriors. It is a story of the human heart, fraught with desires, emotions, and decisions that transcend time. The emotional toll of the war was felt deeply by the survivors on both sides. For the Greeks, victory was tainted by the brutal realities of what they had lost. Many of the warriors who had left their homes to fight in Troy found that their return was not a simple matter of reclaiming what they had left behind. For them, the war had not just been a battle for power. It had been a battle for meaning, for legacy, and for identity. And when they returned to their homelands, they found that their relationships, their homes, and their lives had been irrevocably altered by the decisions they had made and the blood they had spilled. Take Agamemnon, for example. His return from Troy was not the triumphant homecoming one might expect after leading an army to victory. His decision to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia had already left a stain on his soul. That stain only deepened when he was murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, who sought revenge for the death of their daughter. Agamemnon's story became a tragic commentary on the cost of power and the fragility of familial bonds. Even the greatest of kings could not escape the consequences of their choices, and no amount of victory could shield him from the emotional and moral toll of war. Historians still debate whether Agamemnon's death was poetic justice, or simply a tragic end for a man whose actions had been guided by both duty and pride. Was it a necessary consequence of his choices, or was it a reflection of the inescapable fate that the gods had woven for him? Either way, Agamemnon's tragic end shows us that war, even when it results in a victory, is a force that always extracts its price, sometimes in ways we least expect. For the Trojans, the consequences of war were far more dire. Their once glorious city, which had stood for centuries as a symbol of power and culture, was now reduced to rubble. The survivors, both men and women, were left to pick up the pieces of their lives, their identities, and their homes. Their tragedy was not just physical, it was psychological, emotional, and spiritual. The Trojans, like the Greeks, had fought for something greater than themselves: love, honor, and revenge. And in the end, these ideals had led to their downfall. Historians still debate whether the Trojans' resistance in the face of certain defeat was a noble stand, or whether it was simply the result of misguided pride. Could they have avoided the war, or were they simply pawns in the hands of the gods? Either way, their story became a symbol of the futility of pride in the face of overwhelming odds. The Trojans fought valiantly, but in the end, they were unable to stave off the inevitable. Their story is a reflection of the fragility of human endeavors, even those built on the noblest of intentions. But the Trojans weren't the only ones who suffered. The women of Troy, who had experienced the worst of the war's aftermath, were forced into a new kind of captivity. Taken as slaves, many of the Trojan women were subjected to the whims of the Greek victors, their fates sealed by the cruelty of war. For these women, the war had taken not just their city and their loved ones, but their very identity. They were no longer the daughters of Troy, the wives of noble men. They were trophies, property, and survivors in a world that had forgotten their humanity. Historians still argue about the role of women in the Trojan War. Were they simply victims of the gods and the warriors who fought in their name? Or were they active participants in the story of Troy's downfall? Could the women of Troy have done anything to change their fate? Or were they bound by the decisions of the men in their lives? Either way, the women's suffering is one of the most poignant aspects of the Trojan War, an aspect that is often overlooked in the grand epic of male heroism. The gods, too, were not exempt from the fallout of the Trojan War. While they had played a central role in the conflict, their involvement had not been without consequences. The gods, like the mortals they manipulated, were flawed. They were driven by pride, jealousy, and ambition, and in many ways, their actions were as destructive as those of the warriors they guided. The gods meddling in human affairs led to the deaths of countless soldiers, the destruction of cities, and the emotional turmoil that followed in the wake of war. And yet, despite their power, the gods were not immune to the consequences of their actions. They too would face the repercussions of their decisions. Historians still debate whether the gods were mere reflections of human desires and flaws, or whether they were truly the architects of mortal fate. Were they responsible for the suffering of the Trojans and Greeks? Or were they merely players in a cosmic game that they, too, could not control? Either way, the gods' role in the Trojan War reminds us that even the most powerful beings in the universe are not beyond the reach of fate. Their interference in mortal affairs, though vast, ultimately led to the same cycle of suffering and revenge that had plagued the human world for centuries. The Trojan War, then, serves as both a story of epic battles and a lesson about the human condition. It is a story about pride, love, revenge, and the consequences of war. A war fought not just by armies, but by the hearts and minds of those involved. It is a reminder that even in our moments of greatest glory, there are always costs to pay. Whether we are gods or mortals, warriors or civilians, we are all shaped by the choices we make and the actions we take. Historians still argue about what the Trojan War ultimately teaches us. Was it a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition? Or was it a reflection of the eternal human struggle against fate and desire? Was it a story about the fragility of civilizations, or the destructive power of love and revenge? Either way, the lessons of the Trojan War continue to resonate with us today. It is a story that reminds us that no matter how great our victories may seem, there is always a price to be paid. And that price is never fully known until it is too late. As the Trojan War receded into legend, its echoes reverberated far beyond the shores of Greece and Troy, transcending time and space. The consequences of the war were felt not only in the immediate aftermath, but also in the centuries that followed. The stories of the gods, the warriors, and the women of Troy would inspire generations of poets, philosophers, and thinkers, all grappling with the same questions that had haunted the mortals of the ancient world. What is the cost of glory? What is the price of pride? And who truly wins in a war that leaves only devastation in its wake? For the Greeks, the war had been a defining moment. The heroes who had fought in Troy were not just men of action, but symbols of larger ideals. They were embodiments of the virtues and vices that shaped Greek society: courage, honor, revenge, and the pursuit of immortality. These heroes, Achilles, Odysseus, Agamemnon, became archetypes of the human experience, representing both the potential for greatness and the inevitability of downfall. Their stories were not just tales of heroism. They were meditations on the cost of human ambition and the fragility of mortal existence. Historians still debate whether the Greek heroes of the Trojan War were reflections of idealized masculinity or cautionary figures warning against unchecked ambition. Was Achilles' rage and Odysseus' cunning something to be emulated, or was it a warning about the dangers of pride and manipulation? Either way, these heroes' lives continue to resonate, reminding us that the pursuit of glory often comes at a cost that can never truly be repaid. Yet the Greek experience wasn't just one of male heroes. The Trojan War also gave voice to the women who played pivotal roles, though often underappreciated in the telling of the tale. Helen, the woman whose beauty sparked the war, was both a victim and a symbol of the destructive power of desire. Andromache, Hector's wife, represented the suffering of the civilian population, left behind to face the consequences of a war she did not want. Clytemnestra, whose revenge on Agamemnon is one of the war's darkest chapters, stood as a symbol of how women could both be oppressed and wield tremendous power in the face of injustice. These women were not mere footnotes in the story of Troy. They were integral to the emotional and moral landscape of the war. Historians still argue about the role of women in the Trojan War. Were they powerless victims, or were they active agents in the unfolding drama? Did Helen's abduction simply ignite the flames of war, or was her role more complicated, tied to the same forces of pride and revenge that guided the male heroes? Was Andromache's story one of passive suffering, or did it speak to the deep resilience and agency of women in the face of war? Either way, the Trojan women's suffering was real, and their stories continue to be a poignant reminder of how war, though fought by men, impacts everyone. They are the silent victims who are often overlooked in the grand narratives of heroism. The gods themselves, as we have seen, were not immune to the consequences of their meddling. While they may have been the architects of the war, manipulating the fate of mortals according to their whims and rivalries, they too had to live with the aftermath of their actions. The gods' involvement in the war was not just a reflection of divine power, but also of divine flaw. They too were driven by pride, jealousy, and ego, and in many ways, their interference in human affairs mirrored the same destructive impulses that led the mortals to war. Historians still debate the true nature of the gods' involvement in the Trojan War. Were they mere reflections of human behavior, serving as a way for ancient societies to explain the forces of nature and fate? Or did they represent something more, a warning about the dangers of divine intervention in the affairs of mortals? Either way, the gods' actions in the war serve as a reminder that no one, not even the most powerful beings in the universe, can escape the consequences of their actions. The gods' manipulation of the fates of Troy and Greece created a complex web of causality, where the lines between divine will and mortal choice were blurred, and the cost of war became something much larger than the warriors who fought it. The Trojan War, in the end, was not just a story about the clash of armies or the battle between gods and mortals. It was a story about the human condition. It was a story about love and loss, pride and humility, revenge and forgiveness. It showed us that war, no matter how glorious or noble its cause may seem, always leaves behind more than just destruction. It leaves behind emotional scars that linger long after the fighting ends. The Trojan War was a mirror of humanity itself, filled with desires and faults, glory and despair, all bound together in a cycle that repeats itself over and over throughout history. Historians still argue about the ultimate lesson of the Trojan War. Was it a warning about the dangers of pride and vengeance, or a cautionary tale about the fragility of empires and the fleeting nature of glory? Was it a reminder that the gods, despite their power, are still subject to the same passions and flaws as humans? Or was it a story about the futility of war, the destruction it causes, and the price that is paid by both victors and the vanquished? Either way, the Trojan War remains an enduring symbol of the human struggle, a story that continues to resonate with us today. So, as we come to the end of this journey through the Trojan War, take a moment to think about its lessons. The gods may have had their games, and the heroes may have claimed their glory, but it was the ordinary people, those who lived through the war and its aftermath, who paid the ultimate price. The war's legacy is not just one of battles and victories. It is a reminder that, in the end, all wars cost more than we can ever fully comprehend. As the narrative of the Trojan War is woven deeper into the fabric of cultural history, it becomes increasingly clear that its lessons are not confined to the ancient past. The war, with its intricate interplay of gods, heroes, and mortals, transcends its mythic origins to speak to the timeless human condition. The Trojan War is not just an ancient tale about distant civilizations. It is a story of universal human emotions: love, jealousy, ambition, revenge, and the consequences that flow from them. Its legacy speaks to us even today, warning us about the perils of hubris, the destructive power of unchecked desires, and the collateral damage of warfare. One of the most striking aspects of the Trojan War's legacy is its reflection of human nature in all its complexity. The story is filled with heroes, but they are not perfect beings. Achilles, for example, is both the embodiment of valor and the personification of unchecked pride. His rage over the loss of his friend Patroclus leads him to slay Hector in a moment of fury. But it is his own mortality, his ultimate vulnerability, that makes him so relatable, so human. His desire for glory and eternal fame blinds him to the cost of his actions, and in the end, it is this fatal flaw that seals his tragic fate. Achilles' story, more than any other, encapsulates the paradox at the heart of the Trojan War: that the pursuit of glory is often the very thing that brings about one's downfall. Historians still argue whether Achilles' rage was a reflection of the Greek ethos of honor, or whether it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of excessive pride. Was Achilles' quest for glory noble, or was it a warning against the excesses of heroism? Either way, Achilles' tale remains a powerful meditation on the nature of human ambition and the consequences of seeking to outshine everyone else, especially in the most dangerous of arenas, war. And then there's Hector, the noble Trojan prince, whose courage in the face of certain defeat contrasts sharply with Achilles' wrath. Hector fights not for personal glory, but for the survival of his city and the safety of his family. His heroic deeds are motivated by love and responsibility, making him a more relatable, sympathetic figure than many of the other warriors. Yet, despite his virtues, Hector, like Achilles, is ultimately destroyed by the war. His death at the hands of Achilles and the subsequent desecration of his body serve as a grim reminder that no matter how noble one's intentions, war consumes all, heroes and villains alike. Historians still debate whether Hector's death was a tragic inevitability, a victim of the gods' will, or whether it was a consequence of his choice to stay and fight when he could have fled. Was Hector doomed from the moment he took up arms to defend Troy, or did his honor make his fate unavoidable? Either way, Hector's story reminds us of the nobility and sacrifice involved in war, but also of its ultimate futility. In examining these two central figures, Achilles and Hector, the Trojan War reveals a profound truth: that all wars are not simply battles between good and evil, but are instead wars between flawed human beings, each with their own desires, fears, and weaknesses. It's not just about who wins and who loses, but about the toll that war takes on everyone involved: the physical toll, the emotional toll, and the psychological toll that stays long after the fighting ends. For the women of Troy, the aftermath of the war was no less tragic. Women like Andromache, whose husband Hector had died fighting for his people, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. These women, unlike the heroes, had no agency in the war's outcome. They were left to endure the suffering and loss caused by the conflict, and their fate was not one of glory, but of survival. The capture of the Trojan women by the Greeks, and their subsequent fate as slaves, further underscores the brutal cost of war: how those who suffer the most are often the ones who have no part in the fighting itself. Historians still debate the roles women played in the Trojan War's narrative. Were they simply passive victims of the conflict, or did they represent the emotional and moral center of the story? Did the tragic fates of Andromache, Helen, and the others serve as a reflection of the wider devastation caused by war, or were they emblematic of the ways women's suffering is often overlooked in the telling of heroic tales? Either way, their stories remind us that while men may fight for glory, women endure the consequences of the battle. They are the ones who must rebuild, mourn, and carry on in the wake of destruction, and their narratives are as crucial to understanding the war's true cost as those of the warriors themselves. The gods' role in this Trojan War, too, reveals something about the nature of power and fate. The gods, who had once been all-powerful beings, are shown to be as flawed and fallible as the mortals they controlled. Their interference in the war may have seemed divine, but it was often driven by petty rivalry, jealousy, and a desire to control the destinies of mortals. The gods manipulated the lives of the heroes, but in doing so, they also shaped their own downfall. Even the gods, it seems, cannot escape the consequences of their actions. Historians still question the gods' role in the Trojan War. Were they truly omnipotent beings, or were they simply reflections of human desires and weaknesses? Did the gods meddling in human affairs serve a deeper purpose, or was it just another example of how those in power often create chaos by trying to control the uncontrollable? Either way, the gods' role in the war underscores the complex relationship between fate, free will, and divine intervention. Their actions, like those of the mortals, left lasting scars. The Trojan War, then, serves as more than just an epic story of gods and heroes. It is a profound commentary on the human condition, a story of the dangers of unchecked ambition, the consequences of pride, the importance of love and loyalty, and the ultimate futility of war. The Greeks may have won, but the cost was immense. The Trojans may have lost, but their sacrifice became a symbol of resilience and endurance. And the gods, who had played their part in shaping the war, were left to confront the consequences of their actions. Historians still debate the war's ultimate lesson. Is it a story of human folly, divine manipulation, or both? Is it a tale of heroic struggle, or a reminder of the futility of war? Either way, the legacy of the Trojan War lives on, a timeless reminder that, in the end, no one escapes the consequences of their choices, and that the cost of glory is often greater than we can bear. As we reach the final chapters of the Trojan War's narrative, we see that its legacy extends far beyond the physical and emotional destruction that it caused. It is a story that offers both a mirror and a warning to every generation that comes after it, revealing timeless truths about human nature, power, and the consequences of desire. The war, while fought over the most personal of causes, Helen's abduction, became something far greater, an exploration of pride, vengeance, love, and the moral price of ambition. The aftermath of the Trojan War offers a lens through which we can explore the human psyche, the moments of joy and sorrow, triumph and failure, sacrifice and selfishness that define us all. Though the warriors of Troy and Greece may have been immortalized in myth, their stories are inherently human, grounded in desires, choices, and consequences that each of us can relate to, even if we have never set foot on a battlefield. For the Greek and Trojan heroes, war wasn't just a battle of strength. It was a battle of their inner selves. Consider the case of Achilles, whose rage drove him to the battlefield to avenge the death of his beloved companion, Patroclus. In his fury, he tore through the Trojan ranks, leaving destruction in his wake. But what was his reward for this unparalleled heroism? Death at the hands of an arrow shot by Paris. Achilles had everything: strength, glory, and honor. And yet, in the end, it was his pride, the very quality that made him a hero, that led to his demise. His story is a powerful reminder that glory, no matter how hard won, cannot protect us from the inevitable toll of life. Pride, too, has a price. And Achilles' story asks the question, can a hero's ambition ever truly be justified? Historians still debate whether Achilles was a tragic figure driven by a noble desire for fame, or whether his overwhelming pride and temper were the very things that sealed his fate. Was his quest for eternal glory worth the life he sacrificed for it? Did his rage and thirst for vengeance overshadow the nobler qualities he might have possessed? Either way, Achilles' story offers one of the most poignant insights into the human condition, that even the greatest of us can fall, and the cost of achieving greatness can be much higher than we realize. Hector, the noble Trojan prince, stands in stark contrast to Achilles. While Achilles was driven by personal glory, Hector fought for his city and his family. Hector's actions were guided by duty, responsibility, and love, not ambition. He knew his fate was sealed the moment he entered the battlefield, but he fought anyway, driven by the belief that his actions could protect his people, even if it meant sacrificing his life. And sacrifice he did, killed by Achilles in single combat. Hector's death represented the end of Troy's last hope. Historians still debate whether Hector's death symbolized the nobility of selflessness or the tragic futility of resistance. Was his death a sign of the strength of his convictions? Or was it the inevitable consequence of a war that demanded too much from him? Either way, Hector's sacrifice highlights a central theme of the Trojan War, that the most noble actions often come at the highest price. His death, like Achilles's, is a stark reminder that even the most selfless and heroic figures are not immune to the crushing forces of fate and war. For the women of Troy, the aftermath of the war was no less devastating. Andromache, Hector's wife, was left to mourn the loss of her husband and son, and then to face a future as a slave. Helen, the cause of the war, was not left untouched by the carnage either. She had been a pawn in a game played by the gods, yet she, too, suffered the consequences of her beauty and the desires of the men around her. The Trojan women, once the heart of their civilization, were now widows, orphans, and captives, their fates sealed by the war. The men who fought in Troy had gone to battle for their own reasons: glory, revenge, honor, but it was the women who were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Historians still debate whether the role of women in the Trojan War has been underrepresented or misunderstood. Were they mere victims, or did they possess a form of agency that has been obscured by the larger narratives of war and heroism? Was Helen's suffering a result of her own decisions, or was it a consequence of the gods' manipulations? Either way, the Trojan women's stories serve as a poignant reminder that the true cost of war is not only measured in bloodshed, but in the lives of those who are left behind. And so, the legacy of the Trojan War endures. It is a story that transcends time and place, offering lessons about the fragility of civilizations, the destructive power of pride, and the inevitable toll of ambition. It speaks to our desires for glory, our need for justice, and the profound consequences of the choices we make. The war may have ended, but its ripples continue to shape our understanding of the world and ourselves. Historians still argue whether the Trojan War was a necessary conflict, a story of gods and heroes, or whether it was the tragic consequence of divine meddling and human folly. Could the war have been avoided, or was it destined to happen from the start? Either way, the Trojan War remains a cautionary tale about the nature of war and its cost, both in terms of lives lost and the emotional scars that persist long after the fighting ends. The gods may have orchestrated the war, but it was the mortals who paid the price, their lives irrevocably shaped by the choices they made. As we reflect on the Trojan War and its aftermath, we are reminded that the true cost of war is never just the destruction of cities and armies. It is the destruction of lives, the lives of soldiers, leaders, and civilians alike. The Trojan War teaches us that while we may fight for glory, revenge, or love, it is the lives we touch and the choices we make that will leave the deepest mark. The heroes of Troy may be immortalized in myth, but the true legacy of the war lies in its lessons about the human condition, and in the reminder that we are all bound by the consequences of our actions. As we approach the final stages of our exploration into the Trojan War and its lasting legacy, it becomes clear that the war itself was not an isolated event in history. It was a turning point, a cultural and emotional milestone that shaped not only the Greek and Trojan worlds, but the very idea of what it means to live in a society governed by honor, love, vengeance, and the inevitability of fate. The repercussions of the war were not confined to the walls of Troy or the fields of Greece. They reached deep into the psyche of the ancient world, influencing philosophy, art, literature, and even the very foundations of Western thought. The heroes of the Trojan War, from Achilles to Odysseus, became more than just figures of myth. They became symbols of the human struggle. They were not mere characters in a story. They were archetypes, embodying virtues and flaws that all of us share. The story of Achilles, for example, offers a compelling exploration of the pursuit of glory at any cost. His single-minded determination to achieve greatness, his pride and his rage ultimately led him to fulfill his destiny. But it was a destiny marked by loneliness, death, and the realization that glory, when paid for with so much blood, is a hollow victory. In the end, Achilles' story is a tragic one, reminding us that the pursuit of personal fame, when fueled by pride and vengeance, is often an empty goal that offers little in terms of lasting peace or satisfaction. Historians still argue whether Achilles' drive for glory was truly the driving force behind the war, or whether it was a symptom of a larger cultural context in which personal heroism and honor were revered above all else. Was Achilles simply a reflection of Greek warrior values, or was he a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition? Either way, his legacy endures, reminding us that even the most celebrated heroes are subject to the toll of their own desires. In stark contrast to Achilles stands Hector, the Trojan prince, whose motivations were rooted not in personal glory, but in his duty to his city and his family. Hector's heroism came from his sense of responsibility and love for his people, not from a desire to make a name for himself. His death at the hands of Achilles was not just the death of a hero, it was the death of the ideal of selflessness in the face of war. In Hector, we see the tragic consequence of fighting not for personal gain, but for the survival of one's family and society. His story reminds us that even the most noble motivations can lead to a painful end in the brutal reality of war. Historians still debate whether Hector's noble sacrifice was a symbol of true heroism, or whether it was the tragic result of a futile attempt to resist fate. Was Hector's death an act of bravery, or was it an example of the futility of human resistance in the face of the gods' will? Either way, his death represents a powerful reminder that even the most selfless acts are not immune to the destructive forces of war, and that the noblest warriors can be swept away by the tides of fate. And then, of course, there are the women, whose stories are often overshadowed by the male heroes of the Trojan War, but whose suffering and endurance are just as central to the war's legacy. Helen, the cause of the conflict, is often portrayed as little more than a beautiful prize fought over by the men. Yet, in the aftermath of the war, Helen's story is far more complex. She becomes a symbol not just of beauty, but of the destructive power of desire. Her role in the war was not voluntary. She was a pawn in a game controlled by the gods. Yet, as a mortal woman caught in the crossfire of divine manipulation, Helen became a symbol of the helplessness of the individual in the face of overwhelming forces. Historians still debate whether Helen was a victim of the gods or an active participant in her own fate. Was her abduction a result of divine will, or was she complicit in the destruction that followed? Either way, her story highlights the powerless position that women often occupy in war, and the ways in which their fates are shaped by forces beyond their control. Similarly, the women of Troy, like Andromache and Cassandra, were not just passive victims of the war, they were its tragic witnesses. Andromache, Hector's widow, is a symbol of the enduring pain of loss and the long-term emotional effects of war. Her story, though often overshadowed by the male heroes, is one of deep sorrow and resilience. After the war, she is forced into slavery, yet her endurance and her love for her son demonstrate a strength that transcends the brutality of war. Historians still debate whether Andromache's fate is meant to represent the suffering of all women caught in the aftermath of war, or whether it is a commentary on the loss of hope and dignity that war imposes. Either way, her story is a sobering reminder that war leaves lasting emotional scars on those who are left behind, especially those who have no agency in the conflict. The gods, too, as we've seen, are not exempt from the consequences of the war. While they played a central role in manipulating the fates of mortals, their interference came at a cost. The gods were not immune to the human emotions that drove the conflict: jealousy, pride, and vengeance. And in many ways, They were just as flawed as the mortals they controlled. The gods meddling in the Trojan War is a reflection of the way power can corrupt even those who seem untouchable. Historians still question whether the gods were meant to represent the dangers of unchecked power, or whether they were simply a mirror of human flaws. Were the gods simply playing out the same dramas that mortals do, or were they above such petty desires? Either way, the gods' involvement in the war serves as a reminder that even the most powerful beings cannot escape the consequences of their actions. As the Trojan War fades further into legend, its lessons remain as relevant as ever. The war reminds us of the dangers of ambition, the high cost of pride, and the emotional toll of human conflict. It is a story not just of gods and heroes, but of ordinary people caught in the turmoil of a war they didn't choose. The legacy of the Trojan War teaches us that glory, revenge, and desire come at a price, one that is paid by everyone, from the greatest heroes to the smallest victims. And it is a legacy that will continue to shape how we understand the cost of war for generations to come. Historians still argue whether the Trojan War was truly necessary or whether it was an inevitable tragedy. Was it the will of the gods that brought about the destruction of Troy, or was it the pride and ambition of men? Either way, the story of Troy lives on, not just as a tale of battle, but as a meditation on the human experience itself. As we finally reach the conclusion of the tale of the Trojan War, we find ourselves reflecting not just on the events themselves, but on the long-lasting effects of this conflict. It's not just the fall of a city that remains in the hearts and minds of those who hear the story. It is the lasting emotional toll that continues to haunt the survivors and echoes down through history. For the Greeks and the Trojans, the end of the war did not signal the end of their struggles. It was merely the beginning of a different kind of battle. The battle to understand the costs of what had been lost. In the years after the war, both sides found themselves forced to confront the deeper ramifications of the violence they had wrought. For the Greeks, the journey home was fraught with difficulties that were not just physical, but deeply emotional and psychological. Heroes like Odysseus, who had won glory and fame on the battlefield, now found themselves grappling with the scars of war that no amount of triumph could erase. Odysseus's long voyage home from Troy, as he encountered gods, monsters, and temptations, was symbolic of his struggle not only to return physically to Ithaca, but to return as a whole person, capable of reconciling the hero he had become with the man he once was. His journey wasn't just about overcoming external challenges, it was about navigating the inner turmoil that the war had created. Historians still debate whether Odysseus's journey was a metaphor for the emotional cost of war, or whether it was simply a narrative device used to frame the story of his heroism. Was his journey about his desire for home and peace, or was it a quest for redemption from the sins of his past actions in the war? Either way, his story teaches us that the true battle of war is not won on the battlefield, but in the heart and mind of the warrior, long after the fighting has stopped. But not all the Greek heroes returned home to find peace. Agamemnon's death, at the hands of his wife Clytemnestra, was a stark reminder that the aftermath of war isn't just about physical scars. It's about the fractures within families and communities. Agamemnon had sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia to the gods to ensure the Greeks could sail to Troy. And though he returned victorious, his homecoming was poisoned by that very act. His death at the hands of his wife was a tragic consequence of his actions, and it was a final reckoning with the moral cost of war. His story, like Achilles's, reminds us that the pursuit of glory can often come at the expense of those we love most dearly. Historians still argue whether Agamemnon's death was a deserved consequence of his actions, or whether it was a tragedy that highlighted the cyclical nature of violence. Was his murder a just punishment? Or was it a reflection of the devastating toll that war takes on even the most powerful? Either way, Agamemnon's death serves as a poignant reminder that the emotional costs of war extend far beyond the battlefield, and that the personal toll on warriors and their families can be just as devastating as any physical injury. For the Trojans, the consequences of the war were even more severe. While the Greeks returned home with tales of triumph and glory, the Trojans were left to mourn the loss of their city, their families, and their way of life. The women of Troy, who had already suffered the horrors of war, now faced the additional devastation of being captured and taken as slaves. For women like Andromache, whose husband Hector had died defending his city, the war was a personal loss that could never be compensated for by any external victory. Andromache's story is one of profound grief, but also of quiet resilience. She survived the war, but her survival came at a great cost: her dignity, her family, and her identity as a Trojan. Historians still debate whether Andromache's fate represents the suffering of all women in times of war, or whether it is a unique tragedy tied specifically to the fall of Troy. Was she a symbol of the sacrifices women make in wartime? Or was her suffering a reflection of the larger, collective trauma that war inflicts on entire societies? Either way, Andromache's story remains one of the most poignant and powerful narratives in the aftermath of the Trojan War, showing us that the true cost of conflict is often borne by those who have no role in the fighting. And then there is Helen, whose role in the war was both a catalyst and a reflection of the power dynamics that fueled the conflict. Helen's beauty was the spark that ignited the war, but her life after the war was far less glamorous than the legends would suggest. In the end, she returned to Sparta with Menelaus, but their reunion was not one of triumphant love. It was a fragile reconciliation, built on the foundation of a war that had torn their lives apart. Helen's story, like that of Andromache, is a reminder of the personal toll of war and how individuals often pay the price for the actions of others. Historians still debate whether Helen was a victim of the gods and her own beauty, or whether she was complicit in the war that followed her abduction. Either way, her legacy is intertwined with the tragedy of Troy, showing how war, driven by desire and jealousy, often affects the very people who are least responsible for it. As we reflect on the Trojan War and its consequences, we see that its legacy is not just a tale of gods, heroes, and cities destroyed. It is a story about the emotional, moral, and psychological toll that war takes on those who live through it. The war's aftermath wasn't just about rebuilding cities or reclaiming lost glory. It was about the emotional scars left on those who survived. The heroes may have returned home, but their victories were tainted by the grief of loss, the pain of guilt, and the impossible burden of coming to terms with the cost of what they had done. The women, the children, and the families of Troy and Greece were left to pick up the pieces, haunted by memories of a war that they could not control. Historians still argue about the final lessons of the Trojan War. Was it a warning about the costs of human pride and ambition, or was it a reflection of the eternal struggle between love, vengeance, and honor? Was it a reminder that the pursuit of glory often leads to destruction, or was it a tragic tale about the complexity of fate and divine will? Either way, the Trojan War endures as a timeless reminder of the fragility of peace, the consequences of human desire, and the emotional costs of war. It is a story that continues to resonate today, reminding us all of the enduring struggle to understand the consequences of our actions and the long road to healing.